Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto masters his water jutsu and chakras chains in Chunin exams part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. Naruto swam through a dark miasma. He saw nothing. He felt nothing. Despite it all, he continued pushing in what he believed to be a forward direction, not knowing what was front, back, up, down, left, or right. It was like he was floating through an endless cloud of pure darkness, yet what he was moving through was tangible, feeling almost like cotton that had been soaked in tar. Where am I? He thought to himself, feeling weightless in both body and mind. Voices whispered from the darkness, saying all manner of things. Some of them sounded afraid, while others were promising violence. He paid them little mind, however, as he felt oddly disconnected from everything that was going on around him. This wasn't completely unfamiliar to him. The very same voices were always whispering in his mind whenever he tried to sleep. They would taunt and torment him and, in very extreme cases, were even capable of racking his body with immense waves of pain. Suddenly, the darkness split open before him and a vile crimson color glowed through. Out from the opening walked a man cloaked entirely in black. His only noticeable feature was a porcelain mask with a single opening for his right eye. But then, there was the eye itself, gleaming in the dark through the mask, as red as the light he had emerged from, with 3 black tomo arranged in a way that resembled a pinwheel. "Who are you?" Naruto asked with an edge to his voice. The red opening in the darkness from which the masked man had emerged suddenly closed, leaving the area engulfed in darkness once more. Still, Naruto saw the man before him as clear as he would have in broad daylight. His presence wasn't seeming to be acknowledged though, with the masked man looking forward at nothing in particular. "This is the man who took everything from you. Kill him." The random voice that echoed over everything caused Naruto's eyes to widen. It sounded like a multitude of voices speaking simultaneously, with various high and low pitches. On instinct, his knees bent as he entered a combat-ready stance. A razor-sharp kunai was also in his hand, poised to plunge itself into anyone that would attempt to do him harm. He glared, "Explain yourself. What are you?" Rather than receiving a verbal response, Naruto was assaulted with a multitude of visions that he couldn't quite fathom. He could hardly understand what exactly was going on, as he was only seeing snippets that were succeeding one another in rapid succession, but there was some kind of story being laid out before him. A child. A man with striking blue eyes and a mop of spiky blonde hair. A woman, as beautiful as any he had ever seen, with straight red locks that flowed down the length of her back like a river. The very same masked man he had just met moments ago also made an appearance. There was a battle, a towering beast with 9 tails and endless bloodshed. Naruto collapsed to his knees. Much of what he had just been exposed to was a mystery, but he was no fool. He recognized the birthmarks on the faces of the infant he had seen and was able to connect the dots. "My parents," he thought to himself in awe. They resembled him too much not to be. "Kill him," the voice repeated again, reminding Naruto of the masked man standing before him. Looking up toward the masked man once more, he was shocked to see a significant change. At his feet were the bodies of his parents, with dead eyes and large puncture wounds on their chests. Rage filled Naruto's body like water pouring into a cup. Still, as he attempted to lunge forward to attack, he found that he could no longer move. Then, between himself and the masked man, another figure emerged from the shadowy ground. He recognized this one clear as day, and seeing her nearly filled his eyes with tears. She was a rather plain-looking girl with brown hair and black eyes. However, to Naruto, she was perfect. "What happened to me wasn't your fault, Naruto. It was his," she said before turning to point at the masked man, who still had yet to move. "If he didn't do what he did, that monster would have never been put in your belly. I wouldn't have died. It's all his fault." Naruto felt his calmness faltering. "Wait. Don't go," he shouted, trying to reach out to her as she slowly began to vanish from sight. The girl then faded away, as did the masked man. Now once again left alone in the dark haze, Naruto found himself distraught and more confused than he had been before entering whatever this place was. He allowed himself to fall forward, but he hit no ground surface of any kind and entered a free fall through the darkness. "Kill him." And with that, he woke up. The Genesis and Team 7, under the leadership of Kakashi Haddock, will consist of Seori Uchiha, Sakura Haruno, and Naruto Uzumaki. The announcement was drowned out in a sea of noisy children, but the 3 students in question could hear it clear as day. The configuration was odd, as their team comprised the best male student and the 2 highest-rated female students. Most of the other teams had a ratio of 1 girl for every 2 boys, so this new Team 7 was somewhat unique. "Out troublesome," a lazy voice near the back of the class chimed in. "Naruto has to be on a team with 2 girls. I feel bad for him." The boy's comment earned him quite an earful from the blonde, Ino Yamanaka, sitting at his side. "Shut up, Shikamaru." She growled with a fury that didn't quite look right on her rather pretty face. If anything, we girls should complain about always having to be on teams with two boys. Yeah. Another girl in the classroom shouted. She was soon followed by other shouts of agreement from the female portion of their class, minus, of course, Seori and Sakura, with the latter being too shy to get involved and the former not caring at all in the first place. The entire affair quickly sparked a heated argument between most of the boys and the girls in their class, with Kiba Inuzuka and Ino being the de facto leaders of both sides. Funny enough, the boy who had unintentionally started the conflict, Shikamaru Nara, had his head rested on his desk in a deep slumber as the utter chaos unfolded around him. It made Seori wonder if he had stirred up trouble on purpose. Over the loud arguing and the sound of Iruka-sensei attempting to play the mediator, Seori noticed a hushed voice nearby, trying to get her attention. Her new teammate, Sakura, was a somewhat intelligent girl with long flowing pink hair and emerald green eyes. She wasn't the most exceptional fighter in the class. Still, her academic scores were by far the highest, putting her as the second-ranked Kunoichi. I hope we can work well together, Seori, the pink-haired girl addressed, carefully considering her every word in a showing of respect. Seori nodded in acknowledgement before returning to her thoughts. She supposed she could have done worse than Sakura. Had she been forced onto a team with Kiba Ino or God forbid both, she would have quickly lost her mind. Sakura's shyness was advantageous in that way. Maybe we should begin talking with Naruto soon. You know, to develop good teamwork. Sakura continued, for some reason, thinking Seori was interested in getting along. Did the pink-haired girl know who she was talking to? Being friends wasn't Seori's thing. Still, the mention of Naruto's name was enough to cause Seori to glance her shoulder to the back right corner of the room. There sat the blonde in question, at his usual spot, far back and adjacent to the window. His cheek was rested in his palm, and he gazed out the window with seemingly little care for the conflict in the classroom. It made it difficult to tell whether he was aloof or simply a daydreamer. Seori's eyes narrowed as she continued to observe her new teammate. It was tough to gauge just how strong he was just through his appearance alone. The only reason he stood out from the other students in the class was his spiky blonde hair and the strange whisker-like markings on his face. He also wore an orange sleeveless jacket, a blue short-sleeved t-shirt underneath, matching orange pants that extended to his mid-calf, and blue shinobi sandals. Uniquely, he also wore white wristbands on each wrist, with a red swirl symbol, the same symbol on the back of Chunin and Junin vests. Outside of that, he looked like an ordinary kid. Despite being the #1 male student in class, Naruto didn't receive much attention from the girls. Most were wary of him for unexplained reasons and kept their distance. This apparently suited him fine, as he seemed comfortable just being alone. Seori supposed he was similar to her in that regard. Yet, unlike her, he didn't radiate a dark aura that naturally pushed people away. Therefore, it was difficult to pinpoint why he was avoided by so many people. One thing she did know about him, however, was that he was strong. Throughout her years in the academy, she witnessed him mow through the other boys in class with no effort whatsoever. His taijutsu was impeccable, augmented even further by his incredible strength, precision, and, most of all, speed. Shamed as she was to admit it, she had trouble keeping up with his movements at times. Well, either way, I'd say we're lucky to have a teammate like him, Sakura concluded, unaware that Seori's attention was elsewhere. Seori scoffed as Iruka-sensei announced to the class that they were all being released for lunch. Sakura was talking about Naruto as if he was some kind of lucky charm, like his presence was something that should make them grateful. He wasn't all that special. She, more so than perhaps anyone, knew what a true genius was, after all. Naruto couldn't even begin to hold a candle to him. Once the rest of the class started leaving for lunch, Seori took it as her cue to do the same. Just as she began to descend the steps, she felt something press against the back of her neck. Her eyes widened, and faster than most could blink, she spun around and grabbed the offender's arm. Much to her surprise, she immediately found herself staring into two icy blue eyes. "Seori Uchiha," Naruto greeted with a grin. Seori gripped his hand with a surprising amount of force for someone her age, yet he showed no visible reaction to the pain. "I got you there, didn't I? Come on, admit it. You didn't even feel me behind you." Seori glared. She was angry with her new teammate, yes, but she was mostly upset at herself. "Well, you've got my full attention now," she responded, her voice as chilly as the blue eyes that she stared into so intensely. Naruto's smile widened slightly, and while the slight curling of his lip was small, almost unnoticeable, there was an apparent arrogance that Seori immediately found rather familiar. It was clear that he didn't register her as a threat and was apparently attempting to establish some kind of pecking order now that they were on the same team. "That could have easily been the edge of a kunai against the back of your neck rather than the tip of my fingers," Naruto commented, nodding toward the hand the Seori currently had in her grasp. "In other words, it would have been game over for you." The tension between them increased tenfold, to the point where anyone still in the classroom decided that now was the time to make a hasty exit. Seori gripped Naruto's wrist even harder, to the point where she could feel his bones creak. Still, he continued to just smile like an asshole. Then Naruto, Seori, please don't fight, Sakura intervened, sounding predictably timid. We've only been teammates for 5 minutes, and this isn't exactly the best start. As if acknowledging her presence for the first time, Naruto glanced in Sakura's direction. He gave her an appraising look, and it was clear that he did not view her as a person with any business telling him what to do. His attention just as quickly returned to Seori. I'm not like the others you've fought, Seori coldly declared, ignoring Sakura entirely. And you'll find out personally if you ever touch me again. Naruto didn't seem to be all that intimidated by her threat, as it was clear that he didn't take her very seriously. Once that was all said and done, Seori released his wrist from her grasp and left the classroom without another word. Now, only Naruto and Sakura remained, with the latter of the two looking as if she were a rabbit in the presence of a fox. So, do you want to get lunch or something? Sakura asked Naruto with a nervous chuckle, causing Naruto to sigh almost comically. He supposed not all girls could be like Seori. After finishing their lunches, the students returned to the classroom, where they would finally meet their Chunin leaders. As 15 minutes passed, various Chunin entered the room, calling out to their teams before they and their new students left soon after. Most looked as uninteresting as the students they picked up, almost as if they were background characters in someone else's story. With each group allowed to leave, Seori became increasingly frustrated as she was beginning to get the sneaking suspicion that her team would be the last to be picked up. Her teammates seemed to pick up on this as well. Sakura seemed more nervous than upset, and Naruto didn't seem to mind at all, more content to simply stare out of the window. Eventually, as she predicted, they were the last group of students in the room. In fact, they had been waiting so long that Iruka-sensei left to go home, leaving them completely alone in the classroom. It was the quietest Seori had ever recalled the room being, and quite frankly, it felt odd. She would have assumed that the silence would have made her feel comfortable, but it only made her uneasy. Finally, after well over an hour of waiting, the sliding doors at the right of the room opened, and the man they could only assume was their sensei revealed himself. He was a rather odd-looking fellow with spiky gray, almost silver, hair, a mask covering the lower portion of his face, and a hidden leaf headband tilted down to cover his left eye. Naruto and Sakura looked him up and down, whereas Seori glanced toward him through his peripheral vision. While initially, the Chunin didn't look all that impressive, Seori and Naruto seemed tense when they noticed something distinct about him. This man's presence was the kind only developed after years of training and countless battles. He felt so different than any of the academy instructors, who weren't all that far from him in age by the looks of things. How odd, their new sensei muttered, just loudly enough for them to hear. I think I may actually like you guys. Nice and quiet. The statement seemed to put a smile on Sakura's face, who was happy to have made an excellent first impression. Seori couldn't bring herself to care and was about to ask him why he was so late but paused, realizing there was likely no point in doing so anyway. He had the look of a layabout. That was all the explanation that she required. Naruto was the first to stand up, and he descended the steps with his hands resting behind his head. As he did, Kakashi's lone eye seemed to follow him intently. This was done with a level of intrigue that Seori couldn't quite pin. Maybe he was just particularly interested in the number 1 ranked student. It wouldn't really come as a surprise to her, especially because Naruto was a boy. Society tended to view male shinobi as having more potential than kunoichi, so they were usually taken more seriously. Alright, let's get this show on the road, Naruto remarked in a rather laid-back manner. You're pretty late, you know. The gray-haired Chunin tilted his head as he stared down at the much shorter boy. Was I? He asked. I had to wrap up all my daily errands before coming here. You know. Buying groceries, watering the plants, that kind of stuff. Naruto smiled at the comment, clearly seeing what his sensei was trying to do. Ah. So, you're saying that we're less important than grocery shopping? Not really outright saying, more like implying. The corner of Naruto's mouth seemed to twitch in what appeared to be a brief crack in his facade. Sakura was quick to stand up as well and change the subject with a polite greeting. Seori watched as the developing tension died almost immediately and couldn't help but make a mental note that Sakura seemed to be a natural mediator. That would be useful since Naruto appeared to have a habit of seeking conflict with others. Well, I think it's about time we do introductions, Kakashi mumbled, more to himself. Alright, team. Meet me on the roof in a minute flat. Then, before their eyes, he disappeared in a swirl of leaves. The body flicker. Sakura observed in awe, clearly having never seen one in person before. That's an advanced level transportation jutsu. Naruto seemed mildly interested as well, and Seori would be lying if she said it wasn't something she'd love to have in her arsenal. But, remembering their new sensei's instructions, they each got up from their seats and began the trek up to the roof. They had to go up many flights of stairs, and it was clear that the time frame he had given them to make it to the top was actually impossible. What an asshole. Eventually, though, they did make it to the top, only to find their new sensei leaning against the rails, looking both amused and bored at the same time. How that was possible, she'd never know. After they all sat down, he introduced himself as Kakashi Haddock. He asked everyone to give their introductions, including their likes, dislikes, and dreams for the future. However, when prompted to go first by Sakura, he revealed next to nothing about himself. Naruto was chosen first. He rested his chin on his palm and hummed in apparent thought, "Well, as you all already know, I'm Naruto Uzumaki. I like fighting and training, and what I hate isn't really any of your business. I don't think about dreams or goals all that much, but I guess mine would be to become a shinobi that surpasses the likes of even the fourth Hokage." Seori noticed Kakashi's eye linger on Naruto before his attention shifted to Sakura. This was the second time since meeting him that she saw that he had a particular interest in Naruto. At first, she figured it was just due to his academy scores, but now she was beginning to think it was something more. As Sakura began with her introduction, Sayori's eyes wandered as she felt herself losing interest. As she did, she noticed Naruto glancing at her from the corner of his eye. The two stared at one another for a few moments before Naruto did something that made Sayori's blood boil. He winked at her. It was a simple gesture, but based on his smile, it was apparent that he was doing it to get under her skin, and despite herself, it worked as she felt the need to take his head off then and there. "And your turn that is, if you can actually talk," Kakashi said to Seori, interrupting her thoughts and causing her scowl to deepen. "My name is Seori Uchiha," she introduced with a tone that belied little enthusiasm. "I hate many things, and I don't particularly like anything. What I have is not a dream because I will make it a reality. I'm going to restore my clan and kill a certain man." The immediate reaction to her introduction was silence. Only Sakura appeared surprised, whereas Naruto stared at her intently and Kakashi showed no apparent response. It was essentially what she had expected, but she paid it no mind. None of them could understand her motivations, even if they wanted to. There wasn't much more to their first team meeting other than that unless you counted the revelation that they weren't actually genin yet. Kakashi explained that there was a second test, a survival exercise, that would decide whether or not they would be sent back to the academy. He then warned them not to eat breakfast before vanishing in another body flicker. Sayori narrowed her eyes in determination. There was no way she was being sent back. She had far too much to do. They had been told to arrive at the training ground just after dawn, but even after 4 hours of waiting, Kakashi had yet to arrive. As usual, Naruto was lazing about, minding his own business. But, unlike her seemingly unperturbed teammate, Seori was beginning to get frustrated with their new Chunin sensei's tardiness, and surprisingly, Sakura was as well. 4 hours, Sakura muttered, clearly exhausted after waking up so early. He's made us wait for 4 hours. Naruto, casually relaxing on one of the tree branches, decided to chime in, "Loosen up a bit, ladies," he remarked without opening his eyes. It could be a part of his test, you know. The thought actually made Sayori narrow her eyes. Could he be right? Could Kakashi have been watching them this whole time, wondering if they'd be capable of sensing his presence? If that were the case, he was completely hidden from view. Seori was no expert sensor or tracker by any means, so if there was any weakness she had, even if small, it was that. "How do you manage it, Naruto?" Sakura asked, her head resting in her arms. "You don't seem tired at all." Yes, Sayori found that a bit odd as well. Naruto didn't seem like the early bird type, yet he was the only one who seemed unaffected by the lack of sleep. Naruto flinched almost unnoticeably at the question. Almost. Sayori had keen eyes and could notice such things instantly. The secret is finding time to relax throughout the day. I can't recommend the hot springs enough. They do a lot for relieving stress and helping you unwind, Naruto replied with a wink, which told Sayori that he was probably bullshitting. He then shifted onto his elbow and turned to face them. "You hear that, Sayori? Take the hint." Sayori felt her brow twitch in anger and was about to respond, but was interrupted as Kakashi appeared out of nowhere before them. His sudden appearance shocked the group of genin, who instantly prepared for the possibility of an ambush by the much more experienced genin. "Sorry I'm late," Kakashi said, scratching the back of his head. "A black cat crossed my path, so I had to take the long way." Naruto, Sakura and yes, even Sayori slumped forward in a mixture of shock and exasperation. This guy was unreal and, thus far, had done an excellent job subverting all their expectations at every turn. Expect him to be on time? He's late twice in a row. Think you have his personality pegged? He'll go from serious to ridiculous at the flip of a switch. Alright, the masked man said. It seems that it's time to get started. He had been watching them for the past 20 minutes. He wanted to see how they acted when nobody was watching. He was unsurprised to see that Sakura was pleasant enough on her own. Still, it seemed that Naruto and Sayori would be the problems when it came to teamwork. He pulled a pair of bells from his pouch, reveling in the looks of confusion on the young academy students' faces. "As you can see, I have 2 bells in my hand. they're kind of cool, right? His students were unimpressed. Tough crowd, Kakashi mumbled under his breath. Alright. The goal of this exercise is for each of you to take one of these bells from me. His 3 students perked up at hearing that. However, after hearing his declaration, they were all confused. Sensei? Sakura asked in trepidation. There are only 2 bells, yet there are 3 of us. Very impressive, Sakura, you can count, Kakashi said. However, as complicated as that might have been, it wasn't part of the test, so no points for you. He found a disturbing amount of pleasure in seeing the pink-haired girl's angry expression. It seemed that even sweet little Sakura could become enraged after an early morning with no food in her belly. Alright, as stimulating as this conversation has been, let's move on, the gray-haired Chunin said. Since there are 2 bells, only 2 of you will pass, and the other will be returning to the academy. The eyes of each of his 3 students widened in shock, even Seori's. What a creepily dull kid. You'll need to come at me with the intent to kill if you wish to succeed, Kakashi added. You have until noon. Oh. I almost forgot. The one who fails will be tied to one of those 3 stumps. And they'll have to watch everyone else eat. However, if you fail, you'll all be tied to the stumps. And you'll have to watch me eat. As their sensei said this, their stomachs growled. So that was why he'd asked them to skip breakfast. What an asshole. Your time begins now. Start. The Chunin said. As soon as he said this, his students jumped from the clearing into the trees. Well, all but one. Kakashi nearly felt the need to scratch his head when Naruto simply remained standing across from him. Admittedly, he already knew that the kid was a bit different. Still, he expected him to use his opportunity to hide. This was either confidence or stupidity, which were often confused for one another because they were essentially the same thing. You could I don't know hide if you want, Kakashi casually advised. In fact, I'd recommend it. I hear what you're saying, but then I'd just have to find you later, was the casual response he received from the blonde genin. I'd rather just get this over with now and on my terms. For a brief moment, Kakashi felt as if he was standing before a younger version of himself. Funny enough, when first given the bell test by his sensei years ago, Kakashi had also arrogantly challenged him. This Naruto kid was smart and talented, and he knew that better than anyone based on his demeanor. Yep, it was like looking through a window to the past. Kakashi then easily dodged a barrage of shuriken that came his way, weaving through them with the skill of a virtuoso. Right behind them came Naruto, who attempted a strike that would have hit Kakashi directly in his solar plexus. With relative ease, Kakashi could catch the closed fist in his palm, but felt his hand erupt in pain as he did so. Geez, the kid hit like a sledgehammer. And here I thought I'd be able to get some reading in today, he thought before ducking back to avoid a head kick. After having top scores in all fields of shinobi combat back at the academy, it was no surprise that his new student turned out to be such a gem. If not for the fact that the Hokage raised the academy graduation age to 12, Kakashi was confident that this boy and the Uchiha girl could have both qualified for early promotions based on scores alone. Now it was time to put them to the test. What an impressive kid, Kakashi thought to himself. Guess I'll need to crank it up a bit. Suddenly, Naruto vanished quickly, causing Kakashi's single eye to widen in surprise. In the nick of time, he turned around and blocked a kick that would have struck him in the temple. Brutal strength, remarkable speed, and the skill to use it effectively. This kid was definitely top of his class for a reason, but it still wouldn't be enough. Naruto's eyes widened when his ankle was gripped tightly, preventing him from getting out of striking range. Kakashi reared back his right hand and prepared to deal a devastating blow to the now immobilized genin. If the kid wanted to be taken seriously, Kakashi would up the pressure a bit. With his hand still free, in the brief moment that he had, Naruto seemed to realize that continuing hand-to-hand combat in his current predicament would be pointless, so he went through a string of hand seals that made Kakashi's lone eye widen with shock. Torami no mi Tora, the boy muttered, accentuating each of the 5 head seals with their individual name. Water style. Water wall. Immediately after, a stream of water was expelled from Naruto's mouth, forming a wall that forced Kakashi to release his leg, stopping the punch in its tracks. Using Kakashi's surprise to his advantage, Naruto quickly reached for the bells. His fingers managed to graze the metal of the bells before Kakashi jumped back, creating distance. Besides getting slightly wet, Kakashi didn't appear to be winded at all. Who taught you an elemental jutsu? Genin aren't supposed to be able to use those, he said casually, as if unimpressed. Though deep down, he was shocked by the display. That's a secret, Naruto replied with a cheeky smile. Maybe I'll tell you if you show me what you're hiding behind that mask. His lone eye then scrunched up in amusement at the boy's bravado. There's a reason that confidence and stupidity are often mistaken for each other, you know. Naruto quickly flashed through another set of hand seals. This time, it was the sign of the tiger, ox, tiger, and rat. Aware of the particular jutsu, Kakashi slammed his hands onto the ground surface. Just as he did, another torrent of water was expelled from Naruto's mouth. In this case, its shape resembled that of a cannonball. Before Naruto's attack could make contact, a wall of earth rose from the ground in front of Kakashi, ultimately protecting him from any damage. Naruto's eyes narrowed at the display. Water-style jutsu was weakest against earth-style. Kakashi appeared to be well versed in the elemental form which perfectly opposed his. What poor luck. As much as he hated to admit it, he had few options left, time to retreat and plan my next move, he thought to himself. Just thinking about it made his skin crawl, but this was a Chunin, not some academy loser like all of his other opponents. He crouched in preparation to jump back into the trees, but was shocked when he felt his instincts alerting him to danger. Immediately on edge, he surveyed the area but saw nothing. Then, out of nowhere, two hands burst from the ground below him before gripping his ankles tightly and pulling him underground, leaving only his head above the surface. Kakashi casually popped out from the ground a few feet away before slowly making his way toward Naruto. He crouched before the blonde genin and gave him an almost taunting smile. That was Earth style. Headhunter jutsu, he explained in a matter-of-fact tone. Kakashi's expression then grew a bit more serious. You might be a bit different than most genin, he said in acknowledgement of the boy's skills. But in all the wrong ways. At this rate, you won't achieve much of anything as a shinobi even with all of your talent. All he received in response was a look of frustration. Apparently, Naruto wasn't in the mood for jests anymore. Who would have thought? Sighing with apparent boredom, Kakashi simply walked past Naruto's incapacitated body and into the woods, seemingly searching for the other two genin prospects. As he did, Naruto attempted with all his might to wrench himself from the ground, but found that even with his incredible strength, he was trapped with seemingly no way out. Realizing that he had no viable options, he gritted his teeth in frustration. It seems that I've found you, Kakashi teased, his book still in his hand as he landed in front of Seori. They were in a small clearing in the woods, a decent distance from where the training exercise had begun. Despite her best efforts, she had failed to evade the much more experienced Chunin. The fact that he didn't even seem to be trying made her grit her teeth in irritation. I'm not like the others, Seori explained, calm despite her circumstances. I'll be talking one of those bells now. Kakashi chuckled a bit, clearly reminded of his previous opponent, feel free to try. It is the point of the exercise, after all. Not unlike Naruto early, she darted forward with impressive agility, considering her age and rank. If Kakashi were honest, it was clear that she was arguably just as skilled as Naruto in Taijutsu. The only thing separating them was the blonde's insane physical gifts. It seems she won't let me read either, Kakashi thought to himself as he was once again not even given a chance to enjoy his favorite novel. He then quickly had to block an axe kick that would have hit the top of his head. And she's fierce as well. Shock overtook him for the second time today when she also managed to touch one of the bells. He then grabbed hold of her wrists before tossing her away relatively easily. Waiting for her to make the next move, he wasn't surprised when she landed on her feet with cat-like grace. He was, however, surprised when she began weaving through a familiar set of hand signs. Fire style. Fireball jutsu, she uttered before launching a torrent of flames from her mouth. The jutsu appeared to hit him head-on, and Seori could not keep herself from smirking. A nagging voice in the back of her mind asked why he chose not to dodge when he was clearly capable of doing so, but for the most part, she was just proud of landing a blow. Her eyes widened when a familiar voice spoke up from behind her. Isn't it odd? I just had a similar encounter with your teammate just a few minutes ago, Kakashi commented matter-of-factly. However, there was a bit of amusement lacing his tone. Which is funny considering you just said that you're not like the others. You all seem about the same so far. It took a moment before she could break out of her shocked stupor, but before she could turn to attack him, she felt a strike make contact with the back of her neck and everything went black. After delivering the lightning-fast neck chop, Kakashi looked down at the unconscious genin below before his lone visible eye crinkled up in amusement as he admired his handiwork. I enjoy my work far more than I should. I have a feeling he enjoyed doing that, Naruto complained before attempting to rip himself free from his earthly prison for the umpteenth time. The idea that he had actually been defeated was humiliating enough, but how it occurred made it much worse. Of course, defeat against a Chunin was to be expected. Yet, it seemed that Kakashi was taking extra measures to ensure that his loss was more demeaning than necessary. Just as he prepared for yet another fruitless attempt to escape, he heard a familiar voice in the distance. It was Sakura, shouting and seemingly trying to find him and Seori. Initially, he was a bit disheartened to hear her voice. He nearly remained silent so she wouldn't see him in such an embarrassing position. But then, he realized that the only other person who could possibly help him was Seori, so he decided to settle for what he was getting. I'm over here. Naruto shouted. He immediately heard her delighted response as she signaled that she was on her way. Contrary to what Sakura might think, Naruto had always been aware of her, even before the foundation of their team. While most considered him distant and aloof, he was pretty observant of his peers. Sakura wasn't a part of any particular social circle. She kept to herself, however, her secluded nature was due more to her shyness than anything else. Outside of her academics, Sakura was painfully average in just about everything. Ninjutsu, Jinjutsu, Taijutsu, and Shuriken Jutsu all no better or worse than most of the students in their class. This well-roundedness earned her some of the highest marks in their class. Only he and Seori were above her in the rankings. When Naruto finally saw Sakura burst out of the tree line, he smiled and prepared to say something clever, but paused when he noticed the stupefied look on her face. "Sakura?" he inquired, which made her take a shaky step back. "Then Naruto, is this one of Kakashi-sensei's Jinjutsu?" she asked through shaky breaths. "Where's your body?" He simply blinked as a drop of sweat dripped down his brow. "There is no Jinjutsu. I'm stuck underground," Naruto explained, nearly rolling his eyes. "How about you help me out?" Sakura blushed in embarrassment. "Of course. I didn't think that you were a severed talking head or something like that," she said before laughing nervously. "Of course, you didn't," Naruto responded, his voice riddled with sarcasm. "Now, are you going to get me out of here or what?" Sakura nodded like an obedient child and quickly hustled over to him. For a few moments, she observed his predicament, clearly in some attempt to figure out what to do. Then, there was a glint in her eyes, one that made Naruto somewhat nervous. She then reached behind her back and dug around her weapons pouch before smiling when she apparently found what she was looking for. Naruto's eyes widened to astronomical proportions when she pulled out an explosive tag. Hey, what are you going to do with that?" he asked, his voice hurried and clearly nervous. Surprisingly, she ignored him in favor of surveying the surrounding area. Then, with her tongue slightly sticking out in concentration, she began taking slow, measured steps in his opposite direction. He could hear her softly counting her steps under her breath. Naruto then began to sweat profusely as he realized what she was trying to do. "How much experience do you have with paper bombs?" he asked. Sakura kneeled to the ground and carefully placed the explosive. "Not much," she admitted. "But in class, we did learn about the average blast radius of an explosion produced by a paper bomb, so from this distance, at worst, you shouldn't be harmed all that badly." Shouldn't be harmed all that badly? What the hell was that supposed to mean? At this point, Naruto was left speechless as Sakura gave him a wave before jogging back into the woods, where she could detonate the paper bomb without risking her own safety. Now, he couldn't see Sakura, which only made things worse, since now he wouldn't even be given the courtesy of knowing when the damned explosive tag would blow up in his face. "So are you going to count down from 3 or?" Before Naruto could finish, the paper bomb exploded, practically blinding him and ringing his ears. What surprised him the most was the degree of heat he felt on his face, to the point where he could swear that he smelled burning hair. Other than that, all Naruto's other senses seemed to abandon him in the flash of heat. The first thing Naruto heard as the ringing in his ears subsided was his involuntary coughing. Then, his eyes were eventually able to focus back on his surroundings. However, Naruto was keenly aware that his eyes were now susceptible to the sun's brightness. Annoyingly enough, one of the first things he saw was Sakura practically skipping toward him. "Did it work?" she shouted inquisitively. Naruto glared at her approaching form. "Thankfully, no," he snapped, rather uncharacteristically. Looking back, it was an appropriate reaction to nearly being blown up. "Your obvious plan to murder me didn't work at all." An obvious embarrassment, Sakura scratched the back of her head before leaning forward and grabbing Naruto's shoulder. Due to the explosion, much of the ground surrounding him was destroyed, essentially leaving him in a pile of rubble. With a soft grunt of effort, she pulled with all of her might, and Naruto was finally freed. Now that he was finally able to move his body, Naruto was quick to shrug Sakura's hand off of his shoulder before standing to his feet. Then, remembering that he was currently working on a deadline, he looked at the sun and narrowed his eyes when he realized there wasn't that much time until noon. So should we try to find Seori now?" Sakura asked a bit tentatively. Now that Naruto was free and no longer in need of her help, she felt her usual shyness begin to kick in. For a moment, she thought that he hadn't heard what she said, but when she made to ask the question again, Naruto leaped into the trees without a word. Taking that as his answer, Sakura was quick to follow. When Seori's eyes snapped open, she was back up to her feet, immediately assuming a defensive position. She ignored the dull pain in the back of her neck as her eyes scanned the surrounding area. Surprisingly, Kakashi now appeared to be gone, and she quickly realized that she had been defeated, and easily at that. The very thought humiliated her. "Seori? Seori, are you out there?" It was the voice of Sakura that eventually succeeded in breaking Seori out of her self-loathing trance. It was distant, to the point where she couldn't accurately pinpoint where it was coming from, yet close enough to where she could tell that her teammate was growing ever closer. Seori weighed the option of merely leaving, but ultimately, she decided that there wouldn't be any harm in humoring Sakura. She regretted her decision when she saw that he was with her. "Finally, we found you," Sakura exclaimed with a smile as she and Naruto emerged from the trees. Seori took note of Naruto's condition and could see that he was pretty roughed up. She very nearly smirked at the news that he had clearly gotten his ass handed to him, but she was reminded of her own defeat at that moment. So, in the end, Seori's face contorted into her trademarked scowl. "What are you two doing here?" Seori demanded. "Where's Kakashi?" Naruto gave Seori and the clearing a quick look over before responding, "Not sure, but after looking at you, it's obvious that he was just here." Unable to tell if the comment was an observation or an insult, Seori chose to view it as the latter. That fell more in line with what she had observed from Naruto's personality thus far. So Seori stepped forward and prepared to levy an insult his way, but was stopped when Sakura brought herself between the two of them in a surprising gesture. "Alright, you two. Now I get that you don't like each other all that much, but we have more important things to worry about right now," Sakura exclaimed. "This test will decide whether or not we become genin. We've been working our whole lives to reach this goal, so now isn't the time for your silly arguments." Naruto and Seori were too astounded by the outburst to respond immediately. Sakura demonstrated confidence that she had never revealed during her time in the academy. A day ago, if someone told Seori that Sakura Haruno would stand up to the top 2 students in the class, she'd think they were crazy. Surprisingly, Naruto responded first. "She's right," he admitted. "But what's even the point? There are only 2 bells, anyway. If we work together, only 2 of us will pass." Naruto raised a fair point. What was the value of working together if one of them would end up failing anyway? No matter how you sliced it, one of them would be getting the short end of the stick. They all had dreams, and while they were all undoubtedly different, becoming genin was step 1 for each of them. So what would they do? "We'll sort it out after we get the bells," Sakura spoke up. "There's no point worrying about who gets a bell when we haven't even stolen them yet." Neither Naruto nor Seori spoke, but it was clear that they were in agreement. Seeing everyone finally willing to cooperate with one another made Sakura smile. Admittedly, she hadn't expected Naruto and Seori to agree to work together, seeing as they were both so stubborn and, quite frankly, arrogant as hell. "We'll need a plan then," Naruto said before glancing at Sakura. "Well? Any ideas, Brainiac?" Sakura smirked, accepting the Brainiac remark as a compliment. Kakashi leaned against a rather large tree at the center of the training ground as he read from his favorite book. Make Out Paradise was a gripping tale where the main character and heroine, both new to love, begin dating, and their eyes gradually open to grown-up love. It was a classic coming-of-age story that could appeal to almost anyone. However, it also had some rather juicy moments that kept the blood flowing and provided a sense of primal enjoyment. "Master Jiraiya, you truly outdid yourself with this masterpiece," he murmured. "Hopefully, the sequel will hold a candle to the original." Kakashi continued to read, even as he narrowly avoided a shuriken aimed for his head. In the corner of his eye, he could see Naruto charging out of the tree line, and when he saw that the boy was alone, he sighed. He hoped they would have decided to work together by this point. In the history of him giving out this test, unfortunately, none of the candidates seemed to figure that out for themselves. "Seems like someone managed to drag themselves out of the ground," Kakashi remarked with an eye smile. "How was that, by the way? Personally, I've never gotten caught in such a humiliating jutsu. Was it humbling?" Kakashi was immediately forced to avoid a spinning kick that transitioned into a punch, which he efficiently managed to block. The kid was good, but after being surprised by his skill the first time, fighting him again was child's play. Subtly slipping the book into his pocket, Kakashi used his free hand to grab Naruto's ankle and slam the boy to the ground. With a groan, Naruto quickly recovered and rolled away, creating distance. Then, in a surprising turn of events, Seori also stormed out of the forest and immediately attacked him. So this was it, Kakashi thought. Finally, a team discovered the real purpose behind the test and decided to work together. Kakashi defended against Seori's taijutsu and quickly was forced to multitask as he began avoiding being hit by Naruto as well. Together they stood a much better chance. Naruto landed next to Seori after yet another failed attack, but before he could engage again, she gripped his arm and scowled. "That lost, loser," she snapped. "This is my fight." Naruto scowled back before shrugging out of her grip. "I attacked him first. You think I'll sit back and watch you take the bells yourself?" All the pride and satisfaction immediately abandoned Kakashi as he realized that the 2 genin hopefuls hadn't actually attempted a coordinated attack. He glanced over at the clock and noticed that there were only a few moments until noon, and he shook his head in disappointment. Just when he thought someone had figured it out, reality had reared its ugly head. It made him wonder if it was even possible for kids to put aside their differences and strive toward a common goal with selfless vigor. Just as the thought crossed his mind, he felt a presence directly behind him. Shit. He'd allowed himself to get distracted. Over his shoulder, he could see Sakura diving behind him, reaching for the bells. At his front, Naruto and Seori had stopped fighting and both simultaneously charged toward him, obviously in an attempt to prevent him from stopping Sakura from taking the bells. "I'd completely forgotten about you," Sakura Kakashi chastised himself. being attacked from both sides, and with Sakura's hand inching closer and closer to the bells, Kakashi pulled a stunning maneuver and shifted just enough to the right so that Sakura's hand missed her target. He then pushed down on the back of her head, forcing her to fall to the ground before grabbing both Naruto's and Seori's wrists and slamming them into one another. The three genin ended up as a heap on the ground and he was confident that they'd be returning home with bruises. Then the alarm finally went off, signaling that it was noon and the test had concluded. The harsh sound made the three genin forget about their pain. Looks of shock passed over their faces as they realized their gambit had failed and the time to steal the bells had run out. Well, that was anticlimactic, Kakashi remarked with a shrug, looking mostly unimpressed. Deep down, however, he was incredibly pleased with their performance. Now was the final test of their teamwork. He turned to Sakura, which caused her to look as though she were a rabbit in the line of sight of a wolf. That plan was yours, right Sakura? He inquired. When she nodded, he sighed. Well, it could have been better. Your comrades placed their faith in you to lead them to victory, but all you did was lead them to failure, Kakashi criticized harshly. In the shinobi world, failure means death, and you, Sakura Haruno, a failure who would lead your comrades into death, are clearly not fit to be a shinobi. Sakura looked down at the grass below her, a look of sadness violating her otherwise pleasant face. Naruto and Seori were too shocked to say anything as Kakashi turned to address them. You two, on the other hand, I suppose I can work with, seeing as you actually managed to touch the bells, he said, surprising them. In truth, I was ordered to choose two of you three to take on as my team, regardless of whether or not you guys passed. And you two are the shiniest of the three turds. So, congratulations, you pass. Kakashi then held out the two bells for them to take. Seori supposed she should take one and be happy that she passed, however, she wasn't. Instead, she looked to her left and saw Sakura staring at the ground, her face now void of any real emotion, as if he was resigned to her fate. Her hands then clenched in anger. Damn it. Why was she choosing today of all days to play the hero? No. Kakashi raised his single visible eyebrow in confusion at Seori's response. Excuse me? He asked. I refuse to accept a bell from you, Seori explained tersely, with a cold stare. After a few moments of apparent thought, Naruto nodded in agreement. Yeah, I'm out too, he said. If not for Sakura, I'd probably still be neck deep in the ground right now, so I guess I can't just leave her behind. Seori looked at Sakura again and saw her looking at them with pure shock. She quickly looked away, a bit embarrassed by her gaze. The last thing she wanted was for Sakura to think she actually cared about her, which she definitely didn't. Silence reigned as Kakashi stared at the three academy students. If he was surprised by Seori and Naruto's rejection, he didn't really show it. I see, Kakashi responded casually. Then I suppose I'll have to pass all three of you. His words were not exactly what the three genin hopefuls had been expecting, and they each looked up at Kakashi, as if he had grown a second head. Sakura, in particular, couldn't really fathom what was going on, with her mouth opening and closing as she tried to formulate words. Seori absent-mindedly thought that Sakura resembled a fish that had been snatched out of the water. But, you said, Sakura stuttered out. Kakashi smiled, a gesture made evident by the crinkling of his exposed eye. What? That only two of you could pass. Well, I lied. After getting no response from his team, Kakashi continued. Today, the three of you did something nobody in the history of me giving this test has ever managed. You figured out its purpose. Its purpose? Sakura asked. I thought the point of the test was to get the bells. Kakashi sighed. The bells were simply a ploy to divide you all and make you look out for yourselves, he explained before looking toward Seori and Naruto. My words to Sakura were to see if you two would abandon a comrade. So you didn't mean it what you said to me, Kakashi-sensei? Sakura asked, looking a bit hopeful. Of course not, Kakashi confirmed with a smile. Today, you helped Seori and Naruto both, and you were prepared to let them get the bells for themselves, even if it meant you would fail. That is the marking of a true shinobi, one I'd be honored to call my comrade. Sakura lowered her head again, but this time it was to hide the tears prickling up in her eyes. Seori was able to notice, but refused to make any comments about it. If Kakashi's words were enough to bring Sakura to tears of joy, it would be cruel of her to ruin the moment. It was clear that Sakura wasn't used to being praised for his skills as a shinobi. You see that stone over there? Kakashi suddenly asked, pointing at an odd black kunai-like structure that sat adjacent to the river. It was clearly a statue of some kind. That's the memorial stone. On it are the names of some of the greatest shinobi in the history of this village. Really? Sakura asked after wiping her eyes with his arm. What does a person need to do to get their name put on that stone? Everyone on the stone has one thing in common, the masked Chunin explained. They have all died in the service of this village. Kakashi observed the reactions of his three genin and noticed that Naruto was the only one who didn't appear, as though his umbrella had blown away in a rainstorm. It was clear that he was already familiar with the stone. If there is one thing you should remember from your time with me, let it be this, Kakashi advised. In the shinobi world, those who break the rules are trash, that's true, but those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash. The three genin looked toward their sensei in a new light. Perhaps Kakashi was better than they had thought. This marks the end of your examination, Kakashi announced before giving the team a thumbs up. Tomorrow, we will officially meet for the first time as Team 7 and we will begin your training. They're ready. As promised, Team 7 gathered together for training the day following their completion of the bell test. Based on what he had observed during the examination, Kakashi devised several training programs for each student. They were all based on their needs, and the trio would be lying if they weren't a bit excited to find out what they'd be learning. For starters, they spent the first hour of the day doing a chakra control exercise that consisted of walking up a tree without using their hands. Predictably, Naruto and Seori struggled while Sakura flourished, completing the exercise on the first try. However, after a while, Naruto and Seori, by way of their fierce determination, managed to make impressive progress of their own. Alright, that's enough of that for now, Kakashi announced once he was pleased with their results. He watched with amusement as Seori and Naruto fell to the ground, barely able to land on their feet. It took a few moments, but he eventually had their complete and undivided attention. They were all pretty exhausted, even Sakura, who had been running up and down her tree to help improve her stamina. But, he was happy to see that none of his students seemed to lack a strong work ethic. A week from now, we'll begin taking on our first missions as a team, he explained after giving them a few moments to catch their breaths. We'll train every day until then, and by the end of the week, you'll notice a difference in your skill level. After going into more detail about what they would be doing, Kakashi revealed that they would each learn one jutsu during the week. He then handed both Seori and Sakura one scroll each, before telling them to begin practicing in the clearing nearby. They both seemed confused about why Naruto stayed behind, but agreed and walked off into the distance. Just as out of the loop as his two teammates, Naruto looked toward his new sensei for clarification. Naruto, I don't think you're quite aware of how much chakra you actually have, Kakashi revealed out of the blue. It's why you're taking much longer to master the tree climbing exercise than Sakura did. You have so much chakra that it's difficult to control for something so precise. Predictably, Naruto appeared somewhat skeptical. What are you getting at, sensei? He asked. Kakashi smiled, shadow clone jutsu. In a puff of smoke, a perfect replica of Kakashi appeared at his side. For Naruto, it wasn't that odd of a sight, considering all genin were capable of using the clone jutsu. It was an E-rank jutsu that created an intangible copy of one's body without any substance. It had no actual battle use and was mainly used to confuse enemies. The clone jutsu? That's an academy jutsu, Naruto remarked, his tone decidedly dismissive. What does that have to do with me having a lot of chakra? Kakashi seemed as if he was prepared for that very question. Attack the clone I just created, he instructed, much to Naruto's confusion. Come on, do it now. Deciding there would be no harm in humoring the masked Chunin, Naruto shrugged before immediately lunging toward the clone with impressive speed. The clone raised its arms to block the punch, and much to Naruto's surprise, it caught his extended arm and flipped him onto his back, knocking the wind out of his lungs. How? Naruto groaned out loud. That's a solid clone. Kakashi then dispelled the clone into a cloud of smoke like how it appeared. Before continuing, he waited for Naruto to gather his breath and return to his feet. He was really beginning to enjoy teaching, actually. Passing on what he knew while his student waited patiently for him to explain how things worked. Somehow, it felt more fulfilling than completing a mission. It is, but to be more specific, it's a shadow clone, Kakashi explained. It is a Chunin-level jutsu created by the second Hokage. I evenly distribute my chakra among every clone, giving each an equal fraction of my overall power. The clones are capable of performing techniques on their own and can even bleed, but will usually disperse after hit being a strong enough force. Despite his carefree nature, Naruto seemed enraptured by the concept of such a fantastic jutsu. Is this the technique I have to learn by the end of the week, Kakashi-sensei? To his surprise, he received a shake of the head from his new sensei. Not exactly. It's only the first step, Kakashi explained, leaving Naruto mildly perplexed. The jutsu I want you to master by the end of the week is the shadow clone jutsu taken to another level. It's a jutsu so dangerous that it has been declared forbidden, even I have to be extra careful when using it. Naruto's eyes widened slightly. What is this jutsu? He asked. It is the multi-shadow clone jutsu, Kakashi revealed. It is a massive version of the shadow clone jutsu, in which you create hundreds upon hundreds of clones. It can potentially be dangerous to the person performing it, since your chakra is evenly distributed among many clones. Kakashi gave it a few moments for it all to sink in. This wasn't some academy-level technique. It was a deadly jutsu found within the Forbidden Scroll of Seals. At a surface level, it didn't seem all that dangerous. There were undoubtedly jutsu in the Scroll of Seals that were more deadly. Still, the multi-shadow clone jutsu was definitely no joke. Kakashi had heard stories of people creating so many clones and immediately dying of chakra exhaustion. I spoke with the Hokage, and he and I both believe that you are the only person in the village who can use the multi-shadow clone jutsu to its fullest potential, he continued, much to Naruto's shock. Only you possess the massive reserves of chakra required to use it without risk. The Hokage said that. Naruto began but immediately fell silent as he realized the sheer magnitude of what he had just been told. The Hokage said that about him. Kakashi realized that this moment was likely incredibly overwhelming for Naruto. The boy probably grew up thinking nobody was interested in his development. Now, he was learning that the Hokage had enough faith to allow him to learn a forbidden jutsu. At the sight of his bratty little student's pleased face, Kakashi couldn't help but feel a warm sensation in his chest. It felt good being the bearer of good news for once. After letting it all soak in, Kakashi handed Naruto a scroll of his own, and this scroll is the Shadow Clone Jutsu, the basic version, he explained. I expect you to learn it by the end of the day, so starting tomorrow, we can get on to the next step. Do you understand? Naruto nodded before his eyes narrowed in determination. I'll do it, Kakashi-sensei, he assured, before walking off toward the clearing where Seori and Sakura were training. As he watched Naruto walk away, his lone eye widened when he realized something astounding. Just now was the first time that Naruto had ever called him sensei. Sure, they'd only known each other for a little over a day, but Sakura had addressed him as sensei so often that it felt like the word was going out of style. Seori, on the other hand, well, let's just say he had to temper his expectations for her in that regard. Kakashi chuckled. Seori, snarky as she was, didn't address anyone with the proper respect. It took quite a lot to irritate Kakashi, so he hardly took it personally. Now, if she was out there being respectful to everyone other than him, he may have felt some way about it. It was evening now, late evening. Seori was practically drained of all stamina but stubbornly continued to train. Sakura and Kakashi had left long ago, so now only she and Naruto remained. He was on the other side of the clearing, creating what seemed to be clones of himself. From what she could tell, based on his demeanor, he had managed to learn the jutsu Kakashi had given him. So what? She completed hers on the first day as well. Strangely enough, this was the first time they had actually been alone together. In fact, even with all the classes they jointly attended, outside of their brief interactions since becoming teammates, they hardly ever spoke to one another. Seori supposed that she was mostly to blame. Though Naruto hadn't exactly made the greatest first impression when they first interacted. That's enough for today, Naruto suddenly remarked, mostly to himself. He stood up straight and stretched his back. Seori scoffed, what, are you tired or something? She asked, earning a side-eyed glance from her teammate. Nope, but I don't plan on spending the night out here, Naruto explained before gathering his belongings. You can do that if you want, though. Seori hummed before continuing with her training. Whatever you say, sleepyhead. Naruto visibly twitched at what he viewed as an accusatory statement. What are you getting at? He asked, with a noticeable edge to his voice. Seori merely shrugged her shoulders. Nothing, she said. Silence reigned in the clearing, with only the light of the moon above illuminating their surroundings. Naruto was staring at Seori, who was now practicing the hand seals of her jutsu, as if he wasn't even there. His eyes then narrowed comically as he realized she was questioning his dedication to his training. How about we spar, you and I? He asked with a cocky smile. I think we can both agree that this is long overdue. A rare smirk split over Seori's features. I thought you'd never ask, you moron. Seori turned and afforded Naruto her full attention. His stance was loose and void of any apparent weaknesses. She was no fool. She knew that Naruto was viewed by many as the best genin from their graduating class, despite them having similar scores. This spar had a higher purpose in her eyes. Seori would show him that perception wasn't always reality. The two genin exploded towards one another and immediately engaged in hand-to-hand combat. It quickly became apparent that they were both equally skilled when it came to taijutsu. Still, she found that it was getting progressively more challenging to keep up with Naruto's clearly superior speed. Her eyes couldn't track many of the attacks, and only her refined instincts prevented her from taking any solid strikes to her body or face. Suddenly, Naruto attempted a spinning kick to Seori's head, which the Uchiha prodigy countered by ducking and delivering a sweeping leg kick that knocked Naruto off his feet. However, as Seori went in for a strike, Naruto twisted in the air and kicked her in the chest. She managed to block at the last moment, though the force still pushed her back. She was then blitzed, receiving a follow-up punch to the face that sent her tumbling to the ground. To her credit, she stood up quickly, but it was clear that Naruto had gained the upper hand. As if to add to her woes, Naruto disappeared once again before Seori could even blink. She turned over her shoulder to see him now behind her, preparing to deliver what seemed like the final strike of the fight. At that moment, Seori realized just how behind she was in her goal. How could she defeat him if she couldn't even beat Naruto? Suddenly, as if triggered by her anguish, the world around Seori seemed to slow down. Yet, she was surprisingly able to read Naruto's movements. Much to Naruto's surprise, she ducked under his punch and landed a powerful shot to his stomach, knocking him back a bit. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he noticed the change in his opponent. The two charged again, swapping hands at a much more equal level. It was astounding to Seori, as she had never felt so under control in his life. Her perception had increased tenfold, and she was finally able to keep up with Naruto's insane speed, allowing her to dodge many strikes and nearly land a few of her own. I can see, she thought to herself as she dodged a kick that almost took her head off. Her eyes widened in excitement as she saw an opening. I can see. Naruto was knocked back by a kick clipping him on the chin. He rubbed his jaw a bit before standing up, narrowing his eyes in visible irritation. Seori smirked as she realized that Naruto wasn't used to fighting opponents his age capable of going toe-to-toe with him. The two genin stared each other down for a few moments, realizing they had reached an impasse. Clearly, they were dead equal in Jutsu, and continuing to fight in such a manner would be pointless. Then, out of nowhere, Naruto blinked in apparent surprise before his posture stiffened. Those eyes, Naruto muttered with a genuine glare, much to her confusion. Why did he look so uncharacteristically angry? What was he even talking about? Then, it hit her, and she quickly removed her headband from her forehead and used it as a makeshift mirror. Much to her surprise and elation, she did not see her normal onyx eyes looking back at her. Now, she saw a pair of blood-red eyes, each with a single tomo. The Sharingan, she thought to herself in awe. I've finally. You have those disgusting eyes? Naruto asked, interrupting her thoughts. And what if I do? She replied, her voice cold like ice. Is that a problem? Naruto gripped his head with his right hand and clenched his eyes as if racked by a painful headache. Seori wondered if he was suffering the effects of exhaustion due to overtraining. Still, their spar showed that he was far from tired. It lasted for several seconds before he finally relaxed and calmed down. Whatever, he said, his voice sounding genuinely exhausted. I'm leaving. Without another word, he turned and began his slow walk home. 1 week later, the rest of the week passed without much issue, and the genin of Team 7 all managed to rapidly improve themselves within the given time frame. From what Seori could infer, Sakura had delved into Genjutsu over the past week. According to Kakashi, she had an affinity for illusionary jutsu because of her excellent chakra control. It made Seori consider delving into Genjutsu herself. Any Uchiha worth a damn was at least serviceable in Genjutsu. Seori focused mainly on a new fire-style jutsu, though she continued with her regular training regimen, refusing to allow the rest of her skills to dull. The jutsu she learned was called hiding in ash and dust. With this new jutsu, Seori expelled chakra-infused ash from her mouth that blanketed a wide area, burning anyone who came in contact with it. It could be used as a powerful deterrent from attacks, as well as a highly effective smokescreen. Naruto's week, however, was much more of a mystery. He spent much of his time training alone with Kakashi, where she noticed that the two were having one-on-one sparring sessions. So imagine her surprise when she saw dozens upon dozens of Naruto clones fighting against Kakashi, all of whom seemed solid and not illusionary at all. It seemed like Kakashi was treating Naruto with favoritism. It was obvious. How he looked at Naruto differed from how he looked at the rest of the team. There was some nostalgia in his lone eye and genuine care as well. He also seemed abnormally invested in Naruto's individual development. It made Seori wonder if he would ever teach her something useful. Alright, team, Kakashi announced as he entered their little training ground, oddly on time today. Today, we've been invited to participate in a special exercise. I figured it would be a good opportunity to cap off the week before we take our first mission. Sakura, as usual, was the most inquisitive of the group. What kind of exercise, sensei? She asked. Kakashi inclined his head in her direction. The leader of Team 8 has so graciously offered to have our two squads train together today. I felt that by doing so, we'd be able to gauge how much you've all improved during the week. Seori narrowed her eyes in irritation. Team 8 consisted of one of the more annoying people she knew. Kiba Inuzuka. He was by far and away the loudest, most boisterous person in their class. He was the self-proclaimed rival of Naruto, even though he wasn't nearly as skilled. Great. Today, she'd have to once again listen to Kiba make a complete ass out of himself. Team 8 has Hinata on it, right? Sakura asked before glancing at Kakashi for confirmation, receiving a nod in return. She's nice, from what I remember. Looking upon his three genin, Kakashi wondered if Sakura could bring herself to come to blows with her former classmates. She was a kind-hearted person by nature. While she had been excelling and meeting his expectations thus far with her training, he still wasn't sure if she was ready for a mission outside the village. He had similar concerns for Naruto and Seori, but for entirely different reasons. This match would be an excellent test. I have faith in you all, Kakashi continued. Do your best and work together, but there is something very important that you three need to do today. The three genin tilted their heads in confusion. Kakashi smiled, win. They all smirked, Seori included. They supposed they could manage that. They arrived at a location of teammates' choice. Seori was unfamiliar with the particular training ground and found that the forests were denser in this area. Her eyes narrowed. Clearly, this environment favored teammate who could rely on Kiba's sense of smell and Hinata's Byakugan to navigate through the trees and brush. You finally here. Welcome. I'm Kurenaiki, the Chunin sensei of teammate greeted politely. She was a beautiful woman with a slender build, long untamed black hair, and very unique eyes that were red in color, with an additional ring around the pupil. She also wore red lipstick and purple eyeshadow. Unlike Kakashi's standard Chunin garb, her attire consisted of a red mesh armor blouse with only a right sleeve. Well, look who it is, Kiba taunted as soon as Team 7 was in view. You guys look the same as you did at the academy. It's only been a week since we graduated, moron. You look the same too. Seori's words were effective in riling Kiba up. However, rather than getting upset on behalf of her student, Kurenai chuckled a bit. She admired Seori's wittiness and obvious feminine strength. In her opinion, the village needed more young Kunoichi to take up the mantle in the next generation. If it weren't for the fact that my beef was with Whisker Boy over there, I'd gladly kick your ass first, Kiba declared. However, his words failed to elicit a reaction from either Naruto or Seori, much to his annoyance. Hinata, who stood to the left of her teammates, couldn't help but roll her eyes at Kiba's nonsense. The Hokage heiress had always been a mystery to Seori during their days in the academy. Initially, she could only be described as harmless, which was acceptable for a normal lifestyle, but not suitable for a shinobi. Then, however, she experienced a gradual change where she became much more competent. The last remaining member of teammates stood in silence. Unlike most people in their class, Seori was well aware that Shino Aburam was not to be taken lightly and knew that he was nothing like Kiba. He never did anything at the academy that would attract attention. It was also clear that he had been holding back during spars to conceal his abilities. She couldn't really relate to his cautious nature, but there was one thing of which she was sure. He was strong. Seori then shifted her attention to Naruto, looking up at the clouds with his hands behind his head. They still had yet to discuss the incident from their little sparring session. The way Naruto had reacted to her Sharingan was so unlike him. Sure, he was an annoying prick, but he never came off as violent or even remotely aggressive. That night Seori saw hatred burning behind his eyes. Not for her but for the eyes of her clan. So, Kakashi, what do you think? Kurenai asked with a raised brow. Think this is a good place to have a survival exercise between our teams? Any sort of daydreaming or conversation screeched to a halt as Kurenai-sensei laid out the terms of engagement. All at once, they narrowed their eyes in determination. It was more than likely that they would be pitted against one another. Kiba looked in Naruto's direction with a vicious grin. Still, he was completely ignored, which only seemed to fire him up even more. Kakashi cleared his throat. Today will be a 3-on-3 sparring drill, he explained. The team that manages to disable or defeat the other team members wins. Simple, right? But this is merely an exercise between comrades, Kurenai added. That means no lethal jutsu that could maim or kill your opponents. Everyone among the two teams of genin could agree to those terms. They had no desire to kill or hurt each other, that was for sure. Hell, even Kiba merely wanted to beat Naruto to prove his strength. He didn't actually hate Naruto or anything like that. It was as Kurenai-sensei said. They were all comrades from the same village. Even if some of them were more annoying than others. Kiba, Shino spoke up in his usual monotone voice, loud enough for only Hinata and Kiba to hear. Yeah? You and I should work together to defeat Naruto, Shino said as he intently watched the blonde in question. Kiba's reaction was predictably indignant, whereas Hinata appeared somewhat conflicted. What the hell? No way. Kiba growled. I've gotten stronger since he and I last fought. Let me fight him. Shino shook his head. Neither you, myself, or Hinata can defeat him alone, he said, clearly realistic about Naruto's abilities. Why? Because he is the strongest genin from our graduating class. But what about Seori? She's strong as well. She received the same scores as Naruto, Hinata asked, perhaps in an attempt to deflect some of the focus away from Naruto. It was one thing to fight a group 3-on-3, but it was another to gang up on a single person, particularly when it was Naruto. She admired him quite a bit. She is a threat as well, Shino conceded. But my insects warn me that there is something strange about Naruto's chakra. Kiba crossed his arms and decided to glare at nothing in particular. It was clear that Shino was nervous about the fact that Naruto, for the most part, still remained quite a mystery. Everyone knew that he was really good, but not once had he been forced to use anything other than simple taijutsu. With chakra like that, Shino was confident that he also had a talent for ninjutsu. We will isolate him from the rest of his team, Shino planned, talking more than they ever remembered him talking in the past. Hinata will distract the other two while Kiba and I dispatch him. Hinata blinked. Seems like you have this all figured out, she remarked as she crossed her arms. She wasn't arrogant. She was confident that she could do well enough against just about anyone, but fighting Seori while dealing with a second opponent would be a pain. Just distract them for as long as you can manage while we take out the most dangerous threat. But don't worry, Shino concluded ominously as the drill was about to begin. It shouldn't take Kiba and me very long. What do you think they're talking about? Sakura asked, her arms crossed as they watched teammate. Naruto appeared relaxed, as usual, they're probably coming up with a strategy, he deduced. Let's just hope that it's Kiba that's doing the planning. Seori and Sakura both smirked, internally sharing his sentiment. Begin. Kakashi and Kurenai both shouted simultaneously, starting the match. They both smiled with pride as their genin vanished into the forest, deciding not to fight each other directly. May the better team win, Kurenai said politely. Kakashi nodded before pulling his book from his weapon pouch. Yes. The better team will win, he said with thinly veiled confidence. Kurenai raised her brow, noticing the particular tone of his voice. And you're certain that team is yours? She asked. Kakashi simply nodded his head in confirmation. It was no secret that Team 7 had the most talent overall, with the two best students from their graduating class. Yet, that didn't mean that they would work well together as a team. On the contrary, Kurenai felt that her team meshed together perfectly, and in these dense forests, in her mind, there was no chance Team 7 could evade or defeat her squad. I've never known you to be so arrogant, Kakashi, she replied with a smile, not really upset, still viewing this all as a bit of friendly competition. Kakashi shrugged. I'm just acknowledging a fact, he said before looking up from his book and off in the distance. I hope your squad doesn't underestimate mine for their sakes. Sakura's the weakest, Kiba commented as they leaped through the trees. Hinata. You should take her out first. Hinata blinked. Excuse me? Kiba rolled his eyes. When you confront the two chicks of Team 7, you should take out Sakura first. Hinata was beginning to wonder if her teammates were being a bit overconfident. She wasn't a fan of this plan of theirs, and not just because it involved them ganging up on Naruto. No. She felt that they were completely overlooking the other two members of Team 7 if they actually thought that she could beat them on her own. Seori was strong, incredibly strong. They don't stand a chance against you, Hinata, Kiba continued. You're a Hokage. Once you get in close, it's over. Before Kiba could speak any further, Shino intervened. The plan is for Hinata to distract, not engage, he corrected. It would be unfair for her to fight against two opponents alone, especially when Seori is among them. As usual, Shino proved to be the most sensible of the bunch. Since they began working together a week ago, Hinata was surprised at how assertive Shino was. Based on her brief interactions with him in the past, she had always assumed he was quiet because he was shy or lacked confidence. That was definitely not the case. He had no problem speaking his mind or taking control when necessary. It was admirable, actually. Here, Shino continued, handing Hinata a pouch. Use these smoke bombs. You'll be the only person able to see in the smoke because of your Byakugan. Use that to your advantage. Hinata accepted the pouch, feeling more confident in Shino's plan now. Her job was to keep Seori and Sakura occupied long enough for Kiba and Shino to defeat Naruto. Though her heart sank at the thought. The very image of Naruto being forced to fight two opponents on his own was something she couldn't quite stomach. Don't try to defeat them, Shino finished. Just make sure they do not interfere in our fight with Naruto. We'll assist you when we're finished. Hinata nodded in understanding. That seemed more manageable unless Seori showed that she was a whole level above what she had demonstrated at the academy. After all, just like her clan, the Uchiha had been famous for their ocular prowess. Hinata wasn't sure if Seori had the Sharingan yet, but things would probably get rough fast if she did. Their discussion was soon interrupted when Kiba caught hold of a scent in the distance. Hinata activated her Byakugan, evidenced by the bulging of the veins near her eyes and temples. She was immediately able to see Team 7 ahead, and from what she could tell, the group seemed to be talking about something. Her brow raised when she saw Seori flip Naruto off, clearly offended by something he'd said. They're up ahead, in a small clearing, Hinata whispered. Kiba slammed his fist into his open palm and grinned. Alright. He said. Let's do this. Shino spoke before Kiba was given a chance to charge in without a thought. We'll use this ambush as our opportunity to separate Naruto from the rest of his team. Team 7 seemed mildly surprised when a smoke bomb landed at their feet. Their initial reaction was to cover their mouths and noses if it was poisonous. Of course, it was only an assumption, but poison seemed like a tool that Shino would employ. However, they soon remembered the rule against using lethal force. They realized it was likely just smoke being used to hinder their eyesight. Kiba's nose twitched, and he grinned viciously when he identified Naruto's location within the smoke. Without hesitation, he immediately dove into the fray with only a single target in mind. Shino was right at his heels, while Hinata remained perched in a nearby tree. He soon landed directly behind Naruto and elongated in claws in preparation to slash his opponent across the back. However, he hadn't been quiet enough and Naruto managed to react just in time. Now only able to rely on his hearing and instinct, Naruto tensed up when he heard a distinct buzzing approaching him from the side. He lunged back, recognizing that the source of the strange sound signaled some serious danger. His instincts were quickly proven correct when he finally escaped the smoke cloud, only to see a cloud of insects trailing behind him. Once the smoke finally cleared, Seori frowned when she noticed that Naruto had vanished from sight. She quickly realized that he had been separated from the rest of their team to be picked off. Was this teammate strategy? Were they planning on defeating them one by one? Cursing her inability to sense chakra, she focused her hearing and was able to detect combat in the distance. She signaled to Sakura and they sprinted to where she assumed Naruto was, but they were forced to stop when a set of kunai landed in front of them, blocking their path. Seori activated her Sharingan and noticed more smoke bombs attached to the steel weapons. She muttered a curse when the area was engulfed with smoke once more. They left one here to keep us from interfering. Damn it, Seori cursed under her breath before turning to where she could still feel Sakura. They're trying to trap us with smoke. Suddenly, she felt something shifting through the air and pulled Sakura as another volley of kunai nearly hit them, each with smoke bombs tied to the ring at the end of the handle with shinobi wire. Just as the smoke cloud began to fade, another was produced immediately after. I hope Naruto's okay, Sakura said with worry, her voice muffled as she covered her mouth with her arm. He'll be fine, Seori responded, her tone solemn as she remembered their spar. He won't lose. They were then forced to dodge another round of kunai and shuriken. You. Slippery. Bastard, Kiba growled between his attacks, annoyed as none of them managed to land. This was how it always was when he fought Naruto. Meanwhile, the same swarm of insects that forced Naruto to separate from his teammates made another appearance. Not willing to test the danger they presented, Naruto abandoned his scrap with Kiba in favor of finding a location in the forest with more favorable conditions. He eventually settled on a small clearing and decided to make his stand there. It's over for you now, you bastard. Kiba shouted as he and Shino eventually caught up with him. Naruto observed the situation before smirking, oh yeah. So you've finally realized that you can't defeat me alone. Predictably, the accusation set Kiba off. Shino couldn't stop the Inuzuka from charging forward and he cursed the fact that he had to be paired with such an unruly brute. It was clear that Naruto would use Kiba's fragile ego against him. It wasn't all that complex of a strategy, considering how easy it was to rile Kiba up. However, it still showed Naruto to be rather pragmatic. As Kiba was mere feet from reaching Naruto's guard, Shino felt his instincts screaming at him to intervene. Naruto was akin to a coiled snake waiting for the opportune moment to strike, and Kiba's hasty advance provided many openings. Realizing the danger, Shino directed his insects like a conductor and managed to create a makeshift barrier between Naruto and Kiba before it was too late. Calm down, Kiba, he warned. You can't fight Naruto when your mind is clouded by anger. It's how he always defeats you so quickly. Kiba huffed before nodding his head and clenching his fists. This was good. Now it seemed like Kiba had calmed down a bit and recognized the situation they were in. Frankly, Naruto was stronger than they were and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The wall of insects flew back to their master and hovered around him defensively as the three genin stared each other down. Naruto's expression was relaxed as always, though it was clear that he was actively thinking of ways to defeat them. Despite his individual strength, he was at a severe numbers disadvantage. Shino hoped it would be enough for them to pull out the win. Naruto hummed in apparent contemplation before smirking and placing his hands in a strange seal that neither Kiba nor Shino had ever seen. Shino's insects vibrated intensely inside of his body, signaling that there was a serious amount of chakra being poured into whatever jutsu Naruto was about to use. I don't know about you guys, but this is starting to feel unfair, he remarked, causing Kiba to scowl. Let's even the odds a little bit. In puffs of smoke, two perfect copies of Naruto appeared, looking as if they were ready for battle. Kiba scoffed, assuming they were ear-rank illusionary clones, but Shino knew better. Of course, he couldn't claim that he actually understood what they were, but if the smirk on Naruto's face was anything to go by, it was very likely that they weren't ordinary clones. His reservations were proven well placed when the two clones charged toward them and began engaging in direct hand-to-hand combat. They quickly got past their shock and defended themselves as best they could. Kiba fared much better since his main attack style was close-range to jutsu. Shino, however, was a mid to long-range fighter and was currently out of his element. Are these solid clones? Kiba asked after backing away from a kick. It seems that Naruto has learned a new jutsu, Shino grunted after blocking a punch. His eyes then widened behind his sunglasses as he saw that the original Naruto was gone. Damn, he had focused too much on the clones. He looked over his shoulder and saw the original was right behind him, with his arm cocked back in preparation to deal what would likely be a fight-ending strike. Thankfully, Shino was narrowly able to lean back and avoid it by the skin of his teeth. Swarms of insects then erupted from his sleeves, eliminating one of Naruto's clones and forcing the original to leap back to the edge of the clearing. Relentless in his counter-assault, Shino unleashed yet another wave of insects, which Naruto once again moved back to avoid. All a part of his plan, Shino continued attacking his opponent from all angles, slowly but surely directing him toward the river at the edge of the clearing. Naruto seemed unaware that he was slowly approaching the water's edge. It was only at the last moment that he realized the predicament he'd been led into. Unless he could swim faster than Shino's bugs could fly, moving back was no longer an option. He also mentally measured the river's width and confirmed that it was too wide for him to simply jump across. And yet, despite his apparent disadvantage, Naruto couldn't be any more confident with how things were playing out. Shino thought he was clever, pushing him towards the water. If only he knew that water-style ninjutsu was his specialty. He'd never been granted much of an opportunity to utilize them in the academy, so it was somewhat of a trick he had hidden up his sleeve. He began weaving through a familiar set of hand seals, water-style. Water. A small splash from behind him interrupted his jutsu, and as he looked over his shoulder, he saw a puppy flying toward him with bared teeth. He cursed his stupidity. How could he have forgotten Kiba's dog? Naruto honestly hadn't thought that Kiba was smart enough to hide his canine partner to use as an ace in the hole though, it seemed more like something Shino would come up with. Akamaru bit into his forearm with a surprising amount of force. It was actually strong enough to penetrate his jacket sleeve and draw blood. Then, an ominous buzzing reminded him of the insect threat still approaching him from the front. They'd played their cards well, he'd have to give them credit. Seeing that he had no options left, Naruto jumped back and landed in the river with a splash. Predictably, the cloud of insects halted their advance, and Shino narrowed his eyes at the surprising move in the distance. If only Akamaru weren't still just a puppy. Sure, his small size allowed him to flank around without being noticed, but if he were larger, he could have ended the entire fight with his bite. Akamaru. Kiba shouted with concern. Dogs couldn't breathe underwater, after all. Before he could charge forward, a hand on the shoulder stopped him. Kiba, wait, he warned. Something isn't right. Shino parted his cloud of insects so they could get a better view of what was going on. The surface of the water had calmed, with only slight ripples revealing that someone had just jumped inside mere moments ago. Suddenly, Akamaru climbed out from the water without so much as a scratch on him. The poor animal took some much-needed breaths before shaking the water from his fur and sniffing around for his master. It didn't take long for him to find Kiba. He immediately took the puppy in his arms with a degree of concern that looked foreign with his normally feral features. He dove into the water knowing he'd be able to hold his breath longer than Akamaru. Shino deduced. He then frowned. The amount of time Naruto had spent underneath the surface of the water demonstrated familiarity with the element. Was water his affinity? Kiba, get back. If Shino had one weakness, it was his love of insects. They weren't just a tool that he used in battle. No. They were a part of him. They quite literally lived inside of his body by way of a symbiotic relationship. Shino wasn't willing to sacrifice them in sparring to achieve a hollow victory. Therefore, he called them back when a tendril of water suddenly formed out of the lake and threatened to kill his entire swarm. Thankfully, he had reacted quickly enough to get them all away from the impact of the water jutsu. They all receded back into his sleeves alive and ready to be used again as the battle escalated. Surprisingly, however, it didn't. After the initial water jutsu, there was nothing. Then, his insects suddenly began to vibrate inside of him. Almost immediately after, Naruto exploded out of the water, propelling himself into the air. Then, it happened again as another Naruto leaped out of the water. And another and another and another until there were dozens upon dozens of copies flying towards them, almost resembling Shino's cloud of insects due to their quantity. Kiba happened to sum up Shino's thoughts on their situation quite nicely, saying, well, shit. Well, shit, indeed. Seori was beginning to have enough. Whoever was bombarding them with smoke was starting to become more annoying than Naruto on his worst days. Their situation may not seem like that big of a deal, but it was a perfect diversionary tactic. She and Sakura couldn't see it all, and if they ever tried to escape the smoke, they would be at risk of being hit with shuriken which they wouldn't see coming. Whoever it is has to be close to running out of smoke bombs, right? Sakura asked, breathing a bit hard. Seori shook her head, we can't just wait for them to run out. Sakura paused, putting her mind to the test as she attempted to devise a solution. While not nearly as powerful as Seori or Naruto, she could still find a way to be helpful by putting her big brain to work. Alright. We'll both try to escape in opposite directions. That way, they can only target one of us, Sakura proposed. It'll divide their attention, and at least one of us will be able to go help Naruto. There's only one problem. Whoever is targeting us isn't going to make things easy for us, Seori concluded on her own, finishing Sakura's thought. Sakura nodded, that means they'll engage one of us, and they'll probably pick you since you're the greater threat. If they attack you, my job will be to go to Naruto. I'll leave the situation here for you." Deciding that the time for waiting was over, they both ran in opposite directions as planned. Seori ran in the direction Naruto was, hoping that by doing so, she'd find out what the hell was going on with him. She had expected him to beat his opponents rather quickly, and she was beginning to wonder if he had bitten off more than he could chew. He was a cocky bastard, after all. It wouldn't be difficult to imagine him underestimating his opponents. Seori finally cleared the smoke and assumed that the assailant had chosen to prevent Sakura from leaving instead. However, she was proven wrong when forced to duck underneath a palm strike, nearly hitting her temple. She quickly recognized that it was Hinata Hokage who, similar to Seori, was the heiress of her clan. The only difference was that Hinata's clan wasn't extinct. "I'm sorry, Seori," Hinata said, her lavender-wide eyes narrowed in determination. "But I can't let you pass." Things began making sense now. "You were the one who was keeping us trapped in the smoke," Seori deduced. "With your Byakugan, only you could have targeted us with shuriken despite the lack of visibility." Her statement didn't prompt any response, and the two girls faced off for several moments without making a move. After a while, Seori realized that Hinata had no reason to attack first, since her only job was to keep Seori from advancing. Therefore, she reached into her weapon pouch and threw a handful of shuriken toward Hinata, officially making the first move. Hinata effortlessly weaved out of the way, which didn't come as a surprise to Seori. She'd only thrown the shuriken as a diversionary tactic to set up her next move. She leaped into the air with impressive speed and dexterity and landed at Hinata's back. "Fire style," she muttered after forming the tiger seal and allowing the fire chakra to expand in her chest. Fireball Jutsu. The large ball of flames scorched the ground below as it headed straight for Hinata. It proved fruitless, however, since Hinata essentially had complete 360-degree vision. As a result, she could narrowly avoid the jutsu despite its speed and size. Admittedly a bit impressed, Seori closed the distance and prepared to gauge Hinata's skills into jutsu. As expected from a Hokage, Hinata's hand speed was impeccable. Nevertheless, Seori's Sharingan allowed her to avoid the strikes by the skin by just a hair. Hinata was by no means unskilled when it came to taijutsu, but one needed to be fast beyond reason to get past the eyes of the Uchiha clan. So this is the gentle fist. Seori thought internally. She could see the chakra concentrated at Hinata's fingertips. "If even one of those hits me, it'll be bad." "Not bad," Seori complimented after dodging another strike. "But not enough." Her Sharingan glowed a crimson red as she kicked up her speed. Before Hinata could even fathom what was going on, Seori appeared at her back for the second time in their brief fight. And yet, even though she could see the attack, her body wasn't fast enough to keep up with her visual prowess. Seori landed a chop on the back of Hinata's neck and watched as her former classmate crumpled to the ground. The Sharingan and Byakugan both shared a similar weakness. While both jutsu made it easier to see attacks, the user's body still needed to be fast enough to react in time. In that sense, it could serve as a double-edged sword. Nothing was more frustrating than seeing an attack coming and lacking the ability to do anything about it. Seori took in a deep breath of fresh air. It felt good to finally be out of the smoke, even if it only lasted about 5 minutes. She'd never take the purity of air for granted again. Well, time to see what the jackass has gotten himself into. Your genin knows the shadow clone jutsu. Kurenai asked Kakashi in shock as they observed the ending of the survival exercise. Kakashi inclined his head, he took to it like a fish to water, he confessed. It's as if the jutsu were made just for him. Indeed, Kurenai mumbled to herself. She had never seen anyone make so many clones. To think that one of Kakashi's students would be capable of defeating Kiba and Shino on his own. Shino was the trump card of her team, someone she felt could overcome any genin in the village. However, Naruto made quick work of him. And that wasn't even mentioning that the Uchiha girl was supposed to be equally skilled. Talk about an oversaturation of talent. She watched both Team 7 and Team 8 making the long walk back and couldn't help but feel slightly disappointed. Not in her students, no, but in herself. It had only been a week since they had been assigned to her, sure, however, a part of her felt that she could have prepared them better for today. Your genin came up with a good strategy, Kakashi complimented. It was the best plan possible considering the situation. Sometimes you just don't win. It's not the end of the world. Kurenai glared at the ground. Out there in the real world, defeat means death. Kakashi looked away from his book for a moment, which is why we're here to protect them until they're strong enough to look out for themselves. They'll be fine. The two genin then put their conversation on hold when their teams made it within hearing distance. Kakashi watched his team, who were confident and uninjured, and smiled softly to himself. They're ready, he thought. As he made his way home, Naruto couldn't help but walk with a bit more pep in his step. Despite having grown accustomed to defeating his opponents back at the academy, this was the first time he'd really been allowed to let loose and use his ninjutsu in combat. Fighting against Kiba and Shino showed him that he was on the right path. His training had resulted in him being strong enough to simultaneously defeat other members of his graduating class. Naruto. Are you free to talk? The voice was so subdued that he almost didn't notice it among the chatter of other villagers going about their business. He turned over his shoulder and was surprised to see Hinata standing there, looking somewhat nervous. It was a bit strange, seeing as she'd always come off as compass back at the academy. Was she embarrassed by how her team performed during the exercise? Hinata, he replied as a greeting before facing her directly. You need something. Finally able to speak with Naruto alone, Hinata was at a frustrating loss for words. Coming up to this moment, she was sure she knew exactly what she would say to him. However, the instant she caught up with him, all of her confidence was thrown entirely out of the window. This always happened when she was around him, and even now that she was a genin, she still couldn't hold herself together. After compassing herself, I just wanted to say that you and your team did a good job during the training exercise, she complimented. I hear that you managed to defeat Kiba and Shino. She could have pretended that she wasn't surprised when she heard the news, but that would have been a lie. Even someone as strong as Naruto shouldn't have been able to defeat two opponents at once. Especially if one of them was Shino. Apparently, he'd somehow managed to use a clone jutsu that allowed him to make solid copies of himself. That was something she could have loved to see with her Byakugan. Yeah. Kiba was annoying as usual, Naruto replied. And Shino was way tougher than I thought. I probably wouldn't have won if you had been with them. Initially, Hinata felt her cheeks flush at the praise. Naruto had always been incredibly confident, so for him to openly admit that her involvement could have tipped the scales of battle out of his favor meant that he took her seriously as a shinobi. But once she recalled her defeat at the hands of Seori, she felt overcome with shame once more. How could she hope to stand at Naruto's side if she couldn't even be his equal? The two eventually sat down on one of the many benches lined the roadside and talked for what Hinata felt was an eternity. With every exchanged word, she felt her discomfort subside more and more. Naruto was far more easygoing than he came off, and talking with him was no sweat. He was incredibly witty, always replying with some kind of clever remark that couldn't help but make her smile. It was fun. I always knew that Seori was strong, Hinata brought up, changing the topic of conversation. But I felt a clear difference in our strength when we fought. It was almost as if the result of our fight was inevitable, no matter how hard I tried. Naruto's expression grew pensive as he appeared to contemplate her words. She couldn't even begin to guess what he was thinking. Ever since she had first laid eyes on him, Naruto was someone that would be best described as enigmatic. He didn't seem interested in getting to know anyone back at the academy, so all she could do was observe him from afar, which was how she could learn so much about him. Watching him rise from being an unknown kid to the #1 ranked student in class was what inspired her to take her training more seriously. Naruto didn't have a fancy surname that anyone in the village would recognize like she or the other clan heirs in their class did. At face value, he should have never been able to rise above the heirs of the Leaf Village's most powerful clans, yet he did. If he could defy his odds and succeed, then so could she. There's always next time, Naruto replied, causing Hinata's eyes to widen. If you think about it, the loser gets the most out of a spar anyway. It shows you where you have to improve. Hinata continued watching as Naruto smirked. I mean, you probably don't remember, but I used to get my ass kicked all the time, he confessed, much to her shock. I almost thought about quitting a couple of times too, but at the end of the day, I was too stubborn. Wait. Naruto almost gave up on being a shinobi. The very thought alone seemed ludicrous. Naruto took to the shinobi arts like a fish to water, and imagining him working some ordinary job with all that unbridled potential lying dormant inside him was so alien that it was almost comical. She placed her hand over her mouth to stifle a giggle as she imagined Naruto bagging groceries with a disgruntled scowl on his face. Naruto gave her an inquisitive side-eyed glance, looking as though he was about to ask what she found to be so funny. In the end, however, he decided against it. Naruto had said what he said to make her feel better, so he supposed her laughing meant that he had succeeded. The two continued to talk for a bit before eventually going their separate ways. As Hinata returned to her clan compound, she couldn't help but feel her spirit had been uplifted. Deciding to view today's loss as a learning experience, she was now more determined than ever to continue to grow. And once again, she had only one person to thank. My name is Konohamaru. Tell me, Naruto. How do you like your new squad? The Hokage asked with a smile. For whatever reason, he'd been summoned to the Hokage tower first thing in the morning. It was odd, seeing as this was probably the first time he'd ever been alone with the leader of his village. Initially, he wasn't sure if he should be worried or excited, but he was admittedly nervous. This was the professor, the man widely considered the strongest of the 5 Kage. Naruto took a moment to ponder his response. Honestly, he hadn't thought about his impression of his teammates that much. Sakura was nice enough, he supposed. At the very least, she proved far more pleasant than Naruto had initially thought she would be, which was more his fault than hers. Similarly, Kakashi-sensei was proving himself to be a surprise as well. He came off as a bit of a slouch at times, but he'd actually taught Naruto a lot. As for Seori, they're alright, I guess, he answered, hoping the shortness of his answer wouldn't cause any offense. He honestly couldn't think of much else to say. He realized that it was fine when the man nodded in apparent satisfaction. He then pulled what appeared to be a pipe from his desk and packed it with some tobacco. He lit it with a small flame from the end of his finger before inhaling. Naruto could see a visible relaxation in the old man's shoulders, and he exhaled the smoke in a small cloud that hovered briefly around his face before dissipating. Kakashi tells me that you've mastered the multi-shadow clone jutsu, the Hokage continued, causing Naruto to straighten up in his chair. Naruto nodded in confirmation before straightening his posture as he realized he was beginning to lean back in his chair. Thanks for that, by the way. Kakashi-sensei told me you gave him permission to teach it to me. The Hokage waved off his gratitude, there's no need. The speed in which you learned it only confirmed my suspicions about you, he responded. Did you know that my sensei, the second Hokage, created that jutsu? He was also the person responsible for labeling it as forbidden. Yeah, Kakashi-sensei said something about it being dangerous, Naruto clarified. I haven't noticed anything bad so far, though. But now that I've said that, it'll probably kill me tomorrow. The Hokage openly laughed at his reply, which caused Naruto to relax as he realized that the Hokage was actually a pretty laid-back guy. Let's hope not, he replied. Though with chakra like yours, I doubt you'll have any issues. Here it was again, another remark about his chakra. Was it really that abnormal? He'd always known that he had vast reserves. Still, according to Kakashi and the Hokage, he apparently had enough to easily abuse a jutsu that most people would die of exhaustion from even attempting. Have you noticed anything else about it? The Hokage continued, leaning forward a bit. Anything else? Honestly, Naruto thought the jutsu was pretty simple to understand. But clearly, there was more to it than he had initially believed. Was I supposed to? The Hokage waved him for the second time, don't worry, it's easy to miss. Create a clone, and I will show you. Eager to learn, Naruto was quick to comply. He stood from his chair and formed the hand seal ingrained in his muscle memory over the past week. Shadow clone jutsu. In a puff of smoke, a perfect tangible copy stood at his side. The Hokage gave the clone a quick up and down, before apparently smiling in approval of the clone's quality. Excellent, he complimented before turning to the clone. Please leave the room and speak with my secretary. Ask her to tell you her name. After you've finished, dispel. Naruto and the clone were equally confused, but the latter nodded in acceptance of the task before leaving the office. He shut the door behind him, leaving Naruto and the Hokage alone. Though technically, even when the clone was there with them, it was still just the two of them. Do clones ever, not want to dispel? Naruto asked. The thought had crossed his mind several times, and he couldn't think of a better person to ask than the professor. The Hokage chuckled at the question, that would present an interesting ethical dilemma, would it not? He responded. No. Clones don't view themselves as individuals. They think of themselves as an extension of an original body. So when they dispel, they're simply returning to their body. Naruto nodded. That made sense and certainly made him feel less conflicted about creating clones, only to force them out of existence. It felt the worst when he used them for menial tasks like doing chores, which he was sure someone like Iruka-sensei would call an abuse of the jutsu. Anyway, he was glad that they didn't, otherwise, he'd have to go back to cleaning his apartment on his own. Suddenly, Naruto felt his mind invaded by memories that were not his own. The confusion on his face must have been evident because the Hokage was quick to smirk before exhaling another puff of smoke. What is the name of my secretary, Naruto? He asked as if he knew that he'd know the answer. Yumi, Naruto answered as he recalled asking her. He also recalled the weird look she gave him when he asked. The Hokage nodded, now do you see? He asked. When a shadow clone was dispelled, the memories of what they experienced were passed on to the user. It was something that seemed so obvious, and yet, Naruto hadn't noticed it at all in the week that he had been using the jutsu. He supposed it was because whenever he used the jutsu, his clones were assisting him with stuff that he was doing. So they were simply another viewpoint for something Naruto was already seeing. Yeah, I get it, Naruto responded. Is this what today's meeting was for? Partly, yes, the Hokage explained before looking Naruto directly in the eyes. But more importantly, I need you to complete an important mission, my boy. Naruto's brows raised slightly. A mission without his team? That was certainly strange. What kind of mission? The Hokage smiled, though it was different from the grandfatherly smile that Naruto was accustomed to. I need you to babysit my grandson. One would have been able to hear a pin fall in the office. Babysit? Naruto repeated as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Hokage, however, retained his hint of amusement, yes. I worry about him. He keeps getting into trouble. What kind of trouble? Apparently, not all that concerned about it, the Hokage shrugged, he spends most of his free time either evading his attendance or attempting to assassinate me. Normal boy behavior, as I'm sure you already know. Did he say assassinate? Anyway, I think he could use someone like you in his life, the Hokage continued. A role model close to his age would do him quite a bit of good. From the look in the Hokage's eye, it didn't appear that he was being granted the option to decline, so he sighed and reluctantly accepted the mission. As he left the office, he couldn't help but curse his sensei. There was no doubt in his mind that his Kakashi was thrilled to let the Hokage borrow him for the day for something as ridiculous as this. He was probably chuckling about it right now all the while with that stupid book in his face, no doubt. Back in the office, the Hokage continued smoking his pipe in peace. What a nice young man Naruto Uzumaki had grown to be. According to Kakashi, the boy was somewhat tricky to deal with, but he accepted the mission without much fuss. Still, it was evident that he was upset. He could live with that, though. Besides, Naruto would be grateful for the mission later, though he doubted he'd get any thanks anytime soon. You both need this, the Hokage thought with a warm smile. You just don't know it yet. Morning turned to afternoon, and Naruto found himself waiting outside the academy, a place he hadn't thought much about since his graduation. It was strange. As he watched the rank-and-file students leaving class, he felt he was already so different than them, even though it had only been a week since he became a genin. Had he changed that much, or was he always a fish out of water at the academy? Or was he just an arrogant prick, as Seori tended to say? This was where Naruto would pick up the boy Konohamaru, as he was apparently called. Admittedly, a fitting name for a child born from the bloodline of a Hokage. Naruto didn't quite know what his new client looked like, but he'd been told that the staff would bring the boy to him. That was a relief because as he looked into the sea of children, Naruto doubted his ability to even identify someone he knew, let alone someone he didn't. Though, someone who was rather easy to identify was Iruka-sensei, who happened to be Naruto's teacher during his academy tenure. The man weaved through the crowd of children, and as he got closer, Naruto saw what looked like a sheepish look on his face. He immediately felt his stomach sink. "Hey there, Naruto," Iruka greeted with a nervous chuckle. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Konohamaru is missing." Naruto blinked. Missing? Iruka had the decency to look a bit embarrassed. This happens a lot. He'll slip out from under someone's nose to play hooky. A lot of teachers just let him get away with it because he's the third's grandson, he confessed. The boy reminds me quite a bit of Kiba, actually. And just when I thought I'd finally gotten rid of that stress in my life. Really? Naruto groaned. I was told you'd bring him to me. I don't even know what he looks like. Thankfully, Iruka had apparently considered this problem in advance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph of a young, angry-looking kid with black eyes and a gray helmet with a hole at the top that revealed spiky brown hair. Admittedly, Naruto had never seen the Hokage without his gray hair and aged skin, so he had to assume that this was what most Sarutobi clan members looked like. He's a cheeky-looking twerp, isn't he? He mumbled to himself, which earned an eye roll from Iruka. You've never been all that normal yourself, Naruto, Iruka countered. Naruto ignored the comment and observed the picture more to commit it to his memory. In all likelihood, he was about to embark upon a wild goose chase of the highest order. Naruto supposed this only made things more entertaining for the Hokage. In fact, he wouldn't be surprised if the old man had known that something like this would happen. It got Naruto thinking. Perhaps this was a test. He was given a high-priority client that he was tasked with protecting. Now, his client was missing, and all he had was a rudimentary understanding of the boy's physical appearance, but not much of his routine or personality. Though, it was pretty apparent that Konohamaru was a delinquent of sorts. Who else would skip class and attempt to murder their own grandfather on a regular basis? Who's someone that might know where he is? Naruto inquired, figuring it would make the most sense to speak with the person most familiar with Konohamaru. Iruka was quick to reply, that would be Mizuki, he responded, looking somewhat pleased that he was allowed to transfer the burden of this issue onto someone else. He's actually still here, I think. You can catch him before he leaves if you're quick enough. Try the training grounds. So, to find a kid I've never met before, all I have to do is find an academy instructor I've never met before. Naruto inquired, causing Iruka to scratch the back of his head and chuckle. He's got white hair, green eyes, and a bandana for a headband. Outside of that, he wears the same uniform as me, Iruka elaborated, answering the unspoken question. Not the flashiest looking guy around, but you shouldn't have any trouble finding him. Naruto nodded in thanks before navigating through the crowds of children in the direction of the training ground. It was the part of the academy that he was most familiar with, barring, of course, the classroom where he attended classes for 6 years. Many evenings were spent at the training grounds when everyone else had gone home. Knowing that he was still working while everyone else was sleeping or relaxing gave him a mental edge. When he found Mizuki, he discovered that the man was relaxing under a tree. Upon seeing him, Naruto realized that he recognized the man, having seen him around the academy from time to time. He always came off as a nice enough guy, but that impression was based only on the barest of interactions. Mizuki-sensei? Naruto spoke up, which alerted the Chunin to his presence. Mizuki smiled kindly and stood to his feet. Well, if it isn't one of Iruka's students. Naruto, right. He greeted before gesturing toward Naruto's new headband. Though I suppose it's former student now. He extended a hand to shake and Naruto reciprocated the gesture. I'm looking for Konohamaru Sarutobi, Naruto explained. Iruka-sensei told me that you're close with him. Mizuki seemed to ponder the information before smiling again. Well, I always try to speak with Konohamaru from time to time. You know. I think he appreciates it too. I imagine it must be difficult having to get through every day as the Hokage's grandson. Naruto wasn't one to pass judgment on someone that he'd never met and yet, he couldn't really follow Mizuki's logic. Being the Hokage's grandson didn't automatically equate to a happy life. Still, it almost seemed like Mizuki was trying to say that his relation to the Hokage caused Konohamaru difficulty. Doubtful. When thinking about what it would be like to live as the grandson of the Hokage, only perks came to mind. Yeah, I bet, Naruto agreed, though it was apparent he didn't. I'm supposed to look after him. It's a mission directly from the Hokage. Can't really do that if I don't know where he is. Mizuki chuckled softly, then you'll no doubt have your hands full, he replied. Even those of us trained to supervise children have trouble with Konohamaru. He hardly respects authority. But, in the end, you're not much of an authority figure anyway. Maybe that's why Lord Hokage chose you for this mission. Perhaps a different approach is just what Konohamaru has been needing. And here, Naruto thought the Hokage gave him this mission for personal amusement. Well, he still found that to be more likely than what Mizuki was proposing, it was still an interesting theory. Konohamaru may be more likely to relate to someone closer to his age, however, if he was similar to Kiba, as Iruka-sensei claimed, they shared little in common. You seem pretty invested in all of this, Naruto observed. He's Iruka-sensei's student, not yours. Why do you even care? And he needs to be my student for me to care. Mizuki countered with a raised brow. It's that kind of attitude that leads to children like Konohamaru having trouble in the first place. Iruka is a good man and a good teacher, but sometimes he focuses too much on correcting behavior and not enough on finding the root of the problem. Naruto stuffed his hands into his pockets and the root of Konohamaru's problems. He's the Hokage's grandson, Mizuki responded as if it were obvious. In his eyes, that's all he is and all he'll ever be. People don't see him for who he is. When the villagers show him respect, they're respecting his status and his lineage, not him. He's a clever boy and has picked up on this. This was all beginning to amount to a load of useless information in the eyes of Naruto. He had no time to continue this conversation, seeing as every moment that went by meant that Konohamaru was possibly getting further and further away. Naruto thought that getting the kid to follow his instructions would be the most challenging part of this mission. And here he was, nearly an hour into it, and he hadn't even found the brat yet. Do you know where he could be or not? If Mizuki was annoyed by the dismissal of his explanation, it didn't show. Clearly, he was a very patient man, which was likely why he appeared to be in the corner of a troublemaker like Konohamaru in the first place. Any other teacher would have likely gotten sick of the bullshit long ago. He tries to act like he hates it, but Konohamaru loves training, Mizuki revealed. I'd try checking the training grounds around the village. With a nod of appreciation, Naruto turned to leave, however, he stopped when he felt a hand placed lightly on his shoulder. Mizuki looked at him with a slight frown. I hope you can find it in yourself to give Konohamaru a chance. You'd be one of the few that has if you do. Naruto honestly didn't know that the academy had such dedicated teachers. Iruka-sensei always seemed to care about his job, but at the end of class, he appeared just as eager to get home as any student. And here was Mizuki, who seemed his entire life revolved around his students and job. Hell, this whole conversation was about a kid that wasn't even one of his students in the first place. No promises, but I'll try to go there with an open mind, Naruto relented, mostly to appease the man. It seemed to do the trick, as Mizuki smiled kindly once more before removing his hand from Naruto's shoulder. He then nodded in farewell, and Naruto finally left the training ground. Now alone, however, Mizuki's expression shifted into a glare as he watched the blonde Uzumaki walk away. Mizuki supposed plans were made to be changed anyway. Still, this Uzumaki brat was going to be a pain in the ass. It took Naruto a while, but after searching multiple training grounds, he finally found a kid who matched the photo Iruka-sensei had given him. Konohamaru was currently standing at the center of a clearing, performing the ram hand sign and showing clear signs of exertion on his face. Apparently, Mizuki-sensei was right. The kid did seem to enjoy training. However, based on what Naruto saw, Konohamaru wasn't getting anywhere. So, with his presence still remaining unknown, he searched the ground at his feet until he saw a perfectly intact green leaf. It reminded Naruto of his training as a kid and gave him an excellent idea. So, with that in mind, he finally decided to make his presence known. Making a hand sign and focusing intensely isn't enough to summon your chakra, Naruto commented, causing Konohamaru to nearly jump in shock. It makes it look like you're about to crap your pants. What the who the hell are you? Konohamaru demanded, his voice sounding precisely like Naruto expected it to. Squeaky and whiny. Now what was the best way to approach this? Naruto was sure there was probably some really clever way to go about it. For a moment, he even considered keeping the mission a secret since he was confident that the kid probably wouldn't like knowing that his grandfather had assigned him a babysitter. But the kid probably wasn't dumb enough to believe a lie anyway. He eventually decided to be straight up about it. I'm Naruto, and the Hokage tasked me with supervising you, he introduced. Be good, and maybe I'll teach you how to mold that chakra of yours. The boy stared at him, and Naruto nearly smirked as he thought he saw admiration in the boy's eyes. He likely saw his headband and realized he was face to face with someone who could help him get on the fast track to being a shinobi. There was also the possibility that Konohamaru had heard Naruto's name mentioned at the academy. He was kind of a big deal around there, after all. Why would I want advice from a guy named after ramen topping? The response very nearly made Naruto topple forward. So much for admiration. Maybe because he knows what he's talking about. Naruto questioned with an inquisitive gaze, akin to a fox sizing up a rabbit. You're doing it all wrong. Konohamaru scowled, and it looked like the expression was created with his face in mind. It wasn't quite hatred, but it was certainly a look of burning anger. It made Naruto wonder what the kid was so mad about in the first place. Sure, being the Hokage's grandson probably wasn't all that great all the time, but this kid was as edgy as Seori. The only difference was Seori hardly spoke, otherwise, Naruto was sure she'd be just as annoying. Naruto smirked, am I wrong? He asked, causing Konohamaru's brow to furrow even further. Show me what you can do then. Unsurprisingly, the kid didn't need to be asked twice. He lunged at Naruto without hesitation, attempting a punch that was easily avoided. Apparently not lacking in endurance, Konohamaru continued trying attack after attack. However, each proved even less successful than the last. He had the temperament of Kiba but none of the skill. It was almost comical when Naruto thought about it in that way. Hold still, you bastard. Konohamaru roared as he reared his hand back for another telegraphed haymaker. It was predictable enough for Naruto to have time to roll his eyes before catching the fist in his palm. Konohamaru appeared shocked, and before he could react, his wrist was grabbed and he felt his body become weightless. Time seemed to slow as he was effortlessly flung into the air before slamming onto the ground like a sack of potatoes. In the end, he could do naught but groan. Well, that was something, he heard Naruto casually remark. You tired yet? It was at that moment that Naruto finally understood the sick pleasure that Kakashi derived from humiliating him during the bell test. Rather than continue to taunt him, Naruto approached the now prone boy and crouched in front of his face. He felt pleased when he noticed hints of respect and fear in Konohamaru's eyes. However, it was obvious that the former was inspired by the latter. Not that it mattered. So long as he wasn't irritating, Naruto honestly didn't care. And here I was just trying to help you, Naruto lectured. It's not even a part of my mission, and yet for some reason, I guess I was feeling nice today. Konohamaru groaned, that was you being nice. Yep, Naruto responded before holding out the leaf he had picked up earlier. Here. Something to occupy your time. The leaf. Naruto was confident that Konohamaru had no idea what he was getting at. Konohamaru sat up and rubbed the back of his now aching head, what do I do with it? It's called the leaf concentration drill, Naruto explained in the same way it had been presented to him by Iruka-sensei when he was around Konohamaru's age. You place the leaf on your forehead and focus your chakra onto it so it stays in place. He was honestly surprised that Iruka-sensei hadn't taught this to Konohamaru yet. It was clear the boy needed it, seeing as though he apparently had trouble concentrating his chakra. Seeing as chakra was literally the foundation of nearly all of the skills a shinobi possessed, it was odd that the kid was being left to figure it out on his own. Iruka-sensei would have probably taught you this a while ago if you didn't skip class so much, Naruto remarked before handing the leaf over to Konohamaru. Thankfully, the kid accepted without protest. Konohamaru scoffed, I don't need to go to class to learn how to be a shinobi, he countered before placing the leaf on his forehead. Almost immediately, the leaf fell and fluttered toward the grass at his feet. Before it could reach the ground, Konohamaru bent over and nabbed it out of the air. He glared at the leaf as if it alone was responsible for his failure. He quickly attempted the drill again, resulting in another failure. The display made Naruto smile a bit. Sure, the kid was letting his emotions get the best of him, but at least he kept trying each time he failed. It would only be a matter of time before Konohamaru realized he'd need to calm down and focus if he wanted to succeed. 1 hour later, damn it. Konohamaru shouted after yet another failure. In the distance, Naruto sat leaning against a tree, staring at Konohamaru with a deadpan expression. He thought that the kid would come to his senses and realize that what he was doing wasn't going to work. And yet, an hour had passed and he still hadn't asked for any advice. Naruto wasn't sure if pride prevented Konohamaru from asking for help or if he was too dense for the thought to cross his mind. Nevertheless, Naruto was losing his patience. The tree wasn't even good for napping on, either. Sounds like someone could use some of Naruto-sensei's sagely knowledge, Naruto spoke up before standing from his seated position. How about it? Konohamaru, who was once again glaring holes into the leaf for what seemed like the 100th time. He was about to reply to the offer with a snarky comment, but remembered the ass-kicking he'd just suffered, so he decided to be more respectful. Alright, fine, Konohamaru relented. But I'm not calling you sensei. I think I can live with that, Naruto responded in a laid-back tone before taking the leaf out of Konohamaru's hand. Before you can even try the exercise again, you need to relax. Almost immediately, Konohamaru gave him an incredulous look. Relax, really? That's it? He replied, sounding slightly disappointed. I thought you said you knew how to do this. Naruto simply shrugged. I do, but none of my awesome wisdom will do you any good as you currently are, he explained. The whole point of the drill is to teach concentration. To concentrate, you need to be able to let loose a bit. You said Iruka-sensei was the one who taught you this drill, but he's the most uptight teacher at the academy, Konohamaru responded, clearly a bit skeptical. I bet he's never relaxed for a moment in his life, and he can still do it. So why do I need to? I'm not saying my way is the only way, Naruto elaborated. But it's definitely more fun than how they would teach you at the academy. Despite himself, Konohamaru felt a bit excited. Fun? He asked. How's that? Naruto grinned. Konohamaru's brow twitched in irritation as he was now submerged neck-deep in a hot spring. At his side was Naruto, who seemed to be enjoying the soak far more than he was. This was what Naruto considered to be training. Konohamaru was beginning to wonder if his temporary guardian was using this as an excuse to go to have a soak. Well, this is stupid, Konohamaru snidely remarked with his arms crossed and eyes closed. Konohamaru had expected a reply, but he received none. A bit put off at being ignored, he opened his eyes and leaned closer to his companion, and by stupid, I mean really stupid. Once again, his complaint went unacknowledged. Hey. Don't ignore me. Konohamaru then reached to poke Naruto's face, but was stopped when faster than he could blink, he was grabbed by the top of his head and pushed underneath the water. It was only for a moment, and Konohamaru was quickly able to get back to the surface. After coughing and rubbing his eyes, he looked at Naruto and saw that he was still leaning against the edge of the hot spring, as if he hadn't even moved at all. What the hell? Konohamaru shouted indignantly. You tried to drown me. Naruto's eyes finally opened, and he sighed, I'm gonna be honest here, kid. You're making it pretty hard for me to have a good time right now. After processing the response, Konohamaru nearly felt his eyes pop out of his head. This isn't supposed to be about you having a good time. You're supposed to be helping me figure out this stupid exercise. Naruto rolled his eyes. Geez, you're wound uptight, he critiqued. You're the only person I've ever met who can't relax in a hot spring. It's the whole point of going to one, you know. I can't see what's so relaxing about taking a bath with a bunch of naked guys. Konohamaru practically growled. We're the only ones in here, Naruto replied in an exasperated tone, his expression deadpan. Realizing that it wasn't working, Naruto remembered a time when his mentor taught him about the wonders of hot springs. Just thinking back on it made him chuckle a bit under his breath. Back then, he was probably even more of a pain in the ass than Konohamaru was now. Konohamaru's brows raised in confusion as Naruto stepped out of the water and wrapped a towel around his waist. He gestured for Konohamaru to do so as well, and after a moment of hesitation, the younger boy complied. Naruto then leaned against the wall of the hot spring and placed a finger over his lips to signal that they needed to be quiet. Then, much to the young boy's shock, a kunai seemingly made from solid red energy appeared in the older boy's hand out of thin air. How did you do that? Konohamaru whispered in awe. Naruto shrugged, don't ask questions. Just watch. Then, somewhat unpredictably, Naruto placed the tip of the kunai into the wooden wall and began twisting it as if he was drilling a hole. The strange red kunai seemed to make quick work of the wood, faster than any standard metal weapon would have been able to. It was once the task was completed that Konohamaru heard it. The giggling. Go ahead and take a look, Naruto casually instructed, with a smirk that made Konohamaru nervous. With each step toward the freshly drilled hole, Konohamaru felt like he was wading through quicksand. His heart thumped rhythmically in his chest. Though, by the way it pounded against his eardrums, it felt as though it was trapped inside of his skull. Konohamaru leaned forward. Just to take a peek, and then he would pull away. He didn't trust Naruto not one bit. Just a quick peek was all he needed. When Konohamaru finally gazed through the hole, his body froze as he looked upon a bounty that he had never known he needed to see. For once, Konohamaru's mind wasn't awash with thoughts, and his body visibly relaxed, causing Naruto to smirk. Is this heaven? After a few more minutes, that to Konohamaru felt like a blissful eternity, he was pulled back from what he had been seeing. Before he could yell in indignation, he was slapped in the forehead. The force of the blow caused him to stagger back a bit, though he managed to maintain his balance before falling into the hot spring. Konohamaru glared harshly, what the hell was that? Naruto interrupted him before he could continue, opting to simply point at his own forehead while smiling smugly. Bright enough to get the message, Konohamaru quickly reached up to his forehead and was shocked by what he felt. A leaf. And not just any leaf, the same damned leaf he had been slaving over all afternoon while trying to master that stupid exercise. He'd done it. Well, what do you know, Naruto remarked. Seems like I was right. Konohamaru could do no more than stare at the infernal leaf, as if removing it from his gaze would erase the apparent progress that he had made. Without thought, he placed the leaf on his forehead once more and focused his energy toward it, as he had earlier in his training. This time, however, the leaf did not flutter to the ground, but stayed fixed in place, held by an invisible force. I did it, Konohamaru whispered in wonderment. He then shifted his attention back to Naruto. But how? Naruto shrugged, it's not all that complicated of an exercise, he explained. That hour of training ingrained the drill into you, and now that you've finally relaxed your mind, it was as simple as just trying again. Your brain just needed to catch up with your body. The light of the afternoon sun seemed to shine directly onto Naruto's back, illuminating him as if he were some kind of descended angel. Konohamaru didn't know if he'd go that far. Still, it was apparent that this Naruto guy was more than he had initially seemed. He had a way of explaining things in a way that Konohamaru could understand. Back at the academy, the teachers always spoke as if they were reading straight out of a textbook, but with Naruto, it felt like a genuine conversation. Chakra is formed when you combine your physical and spiritual energy, Naruto continued. You can be as diligent as you want with your physical training, but if your mental training is lacking, you'll never be able to use your chakra and become a real shinobi. Konohamaru was in complete awe as if everything was finally coming together for him. It made so much sense. All this time, he'd only been doing half of what it took to be a shinobi. The realization came with shame as he realized that Iruka-sensei had been trying to teach him this stuff all along. All those days where he'd struggled to try and get his unruly student to attend class had actually been with his benefit in mind, and he was just throwing it back into his face. Thinking back, Mizuki-sensei had always likened him to a trailblazer, saying there was no one way to becoming a shinobi and that he should embrace his determination to forge his own path. However, it was only now that he realized it was just an excuse to do whatever he wanted. Nobody could learn alone. Even his grandfather had grown up with mentors of his own. It was then that Konohamaru got a fantastic idea. Take me on as your student. Naruto blanked at the request, which came off as more of a declaration than anything else. Huh? Konohamaru sat on his bed, arms crossed and a petulant expression on his face. No matter how many times he begged, Naruto refused to take him on as a student. It was so stupid. That jerk was the one who decided to teach him stuff today, anyway. And now that Konohamaru wanted to learn more, Naruto suddenly didn't have any interest in helping him anymore. He's just like the rest of them, Konohamaru muttered before falling back onto his mattress. For a moment, he had actually tricked himself into thinking that Naruto was someone that cared about him. But once his mission to watch over him finally ended, he seemed almost eager to part ways. Even if he didn't want to be his teacher, he had at least thought that the blonde genin would wish to be his friend. Suddenly, tapping on his window shocked him out of his rumination. After nearly falling out of his bed, Konohamaru looked outside to see Mizuki-sensei of all people sitting on his windowsill. Despite being on good terms with him, Konohamaru was a bit weirded out by the sudden appearance. Sure, they'd talked a lot at the academy, but this was the first time that Mizuki-sensei had sought him out outside of school. Still, Konohamaru had long since recognized Mizuki-sensei as one of the few people who genuinely cared about him, so he opened his window after his brief moment of hesitation. He felt his trust was justified when Mizuki-sensei simply smiled and greeted him without attempting to get inside his room. Sorry to come over so late, but I was too excited to wait to ask you tomorrow, Mizuki confessed, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. He then grinned in excitement. Well, tell me how your test went. Konohamaru blinked in confusion. Test? What test? Konohamaru felt his stomach churn when Mizuki-sensei simply tilted his head at him, appearing incredibly perplexed. Had he missed something really important today? Upon reaching that conclusion, Konohamaru began to sweat nervously. He could only compare it to someone in class asking you if you did the homework and then realizing that you'd completely forgotten. Wait, Naruto Uzumaki did chaperone you today, right? Mizuki asked before looking alarmed when Konohamaru nodded in confirmation. Oh, I never mind then. The white-haired Chunin then looked as though he was about to scamper off, but a shout of wait from Konohamaru was enough to cause him to freeze in place. Konohamaru's hands gripped his bedsheet so tightly that his knuckles turned white. What's going on, Mizuki-sensei? He asked. Please tell me. The lack of an initial response made Konohamaru even more nervous. Mizuki-sensei was always one of the few who were honest with him and told him how it was. Most people were willing to lie to stay on his good side, seeing as he was the grandson of the third Hokage. Look, I'm probably not even supposed to tell you anything about this, Mizuki replied, looking incredibly conflicted. Every year, Lord Hokage chooses the top-ranked prospect from the most recently graduated class and has them test the skills of a promising student currently enrolled at the academy. If the student performs well, they're allowed to become a genin early. Konohamaru's eyes nearly popped out of his head. So that's what today was about. His grandfather had sent Naruto to test him to see if he was ready to become a genin. It had been a bit suspicious that his grandfather would task a young genin with looking after him. Konohamaru was usually supervised by special genin that had particular expertise in tutoring children. After coming to that understanding, Konohamaru was crushed to realize that if Naruto was there to test him, he must have failed since he didn't end up being promoted to genin. What had he done wrong? He'd managed to complete the exercise that Naruto tasked him with. He then recalled how he and Naruto had initially fought during their meeting and how he got his ass kicked with no difficulty. Was that the test? Had Naruto stuck around after and helped him out of pity? Listen, Konohamaru. It's okay, Mizuki continued, sounding as reassuring as possible. Most students don't even pass the test anyway. So there's nothing to be ashamed about. You can still become a shinobi. You'll just have to wait and graduate with the rest of your peers. At this point, Konohamaru was at his breaking point. No, damn it. He growled. I have what it takes. There has to be another way to prove that I can do it. In his agitated state, he failed to notice the devious smirk that spread across Mizuki's face. Well, there is another way. Naruto awoke to a faint tapping on his window. Initially, he thought he had just been hearing things and tried to go back to sleep. However, when the tapping turned to knocking, Naruto groaned and slipped out of bed. Looking toward his clock, he noted that it was already past midnight. Naruto frowned. Who the hell would be banging on his window so late at night? Upon reaching his window, he was surprised to see Iruka-sensei, who looked to be sweating bullets. Naruto rolled his eyes as he realized what was likely going on. He imagined that Konohamaru had probably gotten himself into some kind of trouble. And seeing as Naruto had just spent the entire day with the little brat, he likely would have to get involved. Great. You knocked? Naruto asked after prying his window open, nearly flinching as the chilly evening breeze tickled his skin. Naruto, did anything strange happen while you were with Konohamaru today? Iruka-sensei frantically asked. No, demanded. Naruto sighed upon realizing that his initial assumption had been correct. Not really, he replied before beginning to rub the sleep from his tired eyes. Why? What did he do? He stole the scroll of seals. Naruto nearly tripped over his own feet. He what? Konohamaru lay flat on his back, his body covered with dirt and burn marks. Lying next to him was the forbidden scroll of seals, now opened and unraveled as he had spent the better part of an hour skimming through it. After finally deciding on a jutsu, he trained harder than ever. It was grueling, and there were several points where he felt his recklessness was putting him in danger. However, despite such worries, he continued. This was his last chance, after all. He wouldn't fail. Not again. Huff, that should be enough, Konohamaru remarked after steadying his breath. Now he just needed to wait for Mizuki-sensei. Almost as if things were going according to schedule, Konohamaru heard a faint thud as someone appeared to land in the clearing behind him. He grinned and rolled onto his stomach to tell Mizuki-sensei the good news, but his smile was quickly replaced with a frown when he noticed that his new guest was Naruto, of all people. What are you doing here? He asked, making no effort to conceal his bitterness. Oddly enough, Naruto appeared a bit more serious than usual. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his expression was solemn. Konohamaru also noticed that he looked as though he had just crawled out of bed, as he seemed to have disheveled hair and tired eyes. This caused Konohamaru to look toward the sky, and it was only then that he realized how late it was. You're joking, right? Naruto remarked, his tone sardonic. Also, why midnight? Couldn't you have screwed up during the day when I was already awake? Having enough, Konohamaru sprung to his feet with a surprising amount of vigor for someone who had just been training for hours. But, standing face to face with Naruto now that the truth had been revealed to him, he couldn't be more resentful. Had Naruto come all this way to try and stop him from passing the test? Did he really hate him that much? After standing to his feet, Konohamaru crossed his arms. Oh yeah? Well, guess what? He replied before smiling. I passed the test. I managed to learn a jutsu from the scroll. Now you'll have to get the old man to change his mind and give me that promotion. Naruto's brow furrowed. Test? What the hell are you going on about now? Nothing was more infuriating than someone continuing to lie even though they and the person they were deceiving already knew that the jig was up. Konohamaru felt his nails dig into his palms with enough force to nearly draw blood. It was a different kind of anger than he usually felt. Before, his frustration had no particular target and was directed toward everyone. Now, it was all focused on a single person, which upped the intensity like a flame in the wind. Stop lying to me. Konohamaru shouted, sick of being treated as if he was some kind of idiot. Mizuki-sensei told me all about it, so you can stop pretending. It was always like this. Whether it was Konohamaru's grandfather, Iruka-sensei, Ibisu-sensei, or now Naruto. Everyone led him around by the nose like he was a damn dog. Konohamaru wasn't deemed fit enough to make his own decisions. It was for that reason that his grandfather saddled him with attendants 24/7. It almost felt like he was some kind of prisoner, all because of the family he happened to be born into. Mizuki-sensei. Naruto pondered aloud before he frowned in realization. A shift in the wind caused his back to stiffen, and he was forced to duck to avoid a Fukma shuriken that would have separated his head from his neck. Upon looking over his shoulder, he was unsurprised to see Mizuki perched atop a tree branch, looking decidedly less pleasant than he had when they met earlier in the day. "I knew you'd become a problem," Mizuki reflected, his tone laced with venom. "I'm not surprised, though. You were born to be a menace." Konohamaru's anger was replaced by frightened confusion. "Mizuki-sensei, what's going on?" He took a step forward to approach his Chunin instructor, but an extended arm from Naruto halted his advance. The newly minted genin had yet to take his eyes off Mizuki, who was now retrieving another Fukma shuriken from his back. It all but confirmed that he had been the one who attempted to kill Naruto mere moments ago, that is if that wasn't already obvious. "You've been duped, kid," Naruto revealed, confirming Konohamaru's fears. "This guy's bad news obviously." The comment caused Mizuki to openly laugh. It was a cruel laugh that made Konohamaru take a half step back in dismay. This wasn't Mizuki-sensei. It couldn't be. Mizuki-sensei wouldn't laugh like that. He wouldn't try to kill someone in cold blood. "Funny coming from you of all people, Fox," Mizuki responded, causing Naruto to tense up. "Konohamaru. You need to run now," Naruto quickly advised. "Don't look back and don't listen to anything he says." Mizuki smirked cruelly. "What? Afraid of your little secret getting out?" Quick to action, Naruto unclipped his shuriken punch and unleashed a barrage of sharpened steel. The attack was deftly avoided by Mizuki, who spun around to the other side of the tree branch, allowing it to take the damage intended for him. His laughter echoed throughout the clearing, as it was evident that he didn't register the two children below him as threats. "You are, aren't you?" Mizuki taunted before raising his voice. "You hear that, Konohamaru? Naruto is keeping secrets from you as well. It's in his nature to deceive people." Konohamaru pushed past Naruto's outstretched arm and clenched his fists in frustration. "What are you talking about?" He was then stopped when Naruto grabbed his shoulder tightly, yanking him back. "Did you not hear what I just told you?" he snapped. "Get the hell out of here. Now." At this point, Konohamaru was at his breaking point. He struggled wildly in Naruto's grip and eventually managed to wrench himself free, causing him and Naruto to stagger. The blonde looked surprised when he saw the expression of pure hurt plastered over Konohamaru's face. Gone was the childish anger and frustration, as it was replaced with a look of a boy who had been betrayed and didn't know who to trust. "Damn it, I'm sick of it," he growled. "Stop trying to act like you want me to leave because you care about me, you bastard. You just want me to get lost because you think I'm a nuisance like everyone else. You think that I'll just get in your way." "Konohamaru, I can fight too, you know." Konohamaru interrupted. "I learned a jutsu from the scroll all by myself." Naruto made to speak again, but was forced to lunge forward and push Konohamaru to the ground to protect them both from yet another shuriken thrown by Mizuki. Unfortunately, however, this one had nearly been successful, and Naruto had received a moderately sized cut on his left arm as a reward for getting distracted. If he were an average person, he'd need stitches for sure. He gritted his teeth in pain and glared up at Mizuki with bloodshot eyes that almost trembled with rage. The expression must have been rather intimidating, as it caused Mizuki to briefly pause in surprise. He then shook his head in apparent disgust before the cruel smirk returned to his face. "Ah, so you finally begin to reveal yourself," he observed. "Now you're almost like I expected you to look, Nine Tails." Upon hearing the odd way that Mizuki addressed Naruto, Konohamaru looked up toward the blonde genin and was shocked at what he saw. The fierce glare. The strange whisker-like marks that until now looked so foreign on his face. It all was beginning to make sense now. Naruto was a Nine Tails. Konohamaru muttered under his breath. Young as he was, Konohamaru wasn't all that familiar with the details of the Nine Tails attack. Nevertheless, he knew that many people died that night, his grandmother included. Even though 12 years had passed since that day, the tragedy was still quite a sore subject. "That's right. Naruto is the very beast that killed so many of our people 12 years ago. He's the nine-tailed fox given a human form," Mizuki announced with spiteful glee, confirming Konohamaru's suspicions. "He's biding his time. Waiting for the perfect opportunity to reveal his true nature so that he can regain his former strength." Was something like that even possible? If it was all true, then Naruto was a hell of an actor. Sure, he was an annoying prick who seemed talented at pissing people off, but he never came off as evil or manipulative. In fact, Konohamaru felt completely comfortable around him. It was one of the reasons that he wanted to become his student. "Are you finished?" Naruto replied, not sounding all that affected by Mizuki's talk. Suddenly, two glowing red chains seemed to sprout out of Naruto's back, with sharp points at the end that were poised to skewer the Mao the Academy instructor. Same as earlier, Mizuki allowed the tree to take the damage in his stead, but was shocked when one of the chains managed to pierce through the entirety of the tree, mere inches away from hitting him. This boy was definitely dangerous. The chains vanished into thin air, and two glowing red kunai appeared in Naruto's hands. He held them in a reverse grip and seemed prepared to leap into action, however, he was stopped before he could manage. Naruto noticed an extreme, almost unnatural heat radiating from behind his back. He turned over his shoulder to see Konohamaru, who seemed to be the source of the odd change in temperature. Konohamaru appeared mostly normal, with the only oddity being the smoky vapor that seemed to emit from his skin. His eyes, however, were what Naruto noticed first. The pupils and whites of his eyes were gone, replaced entirely by an orange color that seemed to flicker like a flame. Naruto soon took an involuntary step back as the heat appeared to increase. The grass around them began to wither away into ash, and Naruto could feel his skin begin to sting. "I told you that I learned a new jutsu," Konohamaru declared, with smoke escaping from his mouth. "My mistake caused this, so let me handle it. I can take him." Naruto was conflicted, "Kid, stubborn as always," Konohamaru grinned, "if I kick this guy's ass, you'll have no choice but to take me on as your student." "Right, boss." Before Naruto could voice any approval or opposition, Konohamaru burst into action, leaping toward Mizuki's perched position. His every movement seemed to scorch anything unfortunate to come close to his body. Both Mizuki and Naruto were equally shocked by the display of physical prowess. What was this jutsu? It was clearly forbidden for a reason, as the collateral damage had the potential to be devastating. Mizuki was forced to abandon his hiding spot to create more distance. Konohamaru continued to pursue relentlessly, appearing slightly demonic with his fiery eyes and almost glowing skin. Realizing that a hand-to-hand clash would be suicide, Mizuki unleashed a Fukma Shuriken at his new opponent. Konohamaru dodged a projectile and lunged forward with even greater speed. He opened his mouth and roared, releasing a torrent of flames from the pit of his stomach. To avoid being burned by the fire, Mizuki dove down and landed at the center of yet another clearing. Konohamaru quickly caught up and the two finally stood face to face. It was the first time since Mizuki's betrayal that Konohamaru was really given a good opportunity to look him in the eye. He saw malice, jealousy, anger, and, most prevalent now, fear. Konohamaru was strong enough to make someone like Mizuki afraid. And yet, he felt no pleasure or pride. Only sadness and regret. The woods surrounding them had caught fire in the wake of Konohamaru's last assault. Mizuki frantically observed his surroundings as he tried to identify some means of getting away. At this point, he didn't even want to scroll anymore. He'd be happy enough if he could just escape with his life. Finally, realizing that there was no escaping, he lost hope. "Listen, Konohamaru. I'm sorry that I lied to you, but you need to believe me when I tell you that everything I've ever said to you is true," Mizuki said. "All those days together at the academy. Remember? I always was able to see things in you that other people couldn't. I was able to realize your potential." Konohamaru scowled, "All you ever did was convince me that I didn't need to change, that I was too special to listen to anyone else," he countered. "You wanted me to think there were shortcuts to becoming a shinobi, also you could trick me." A wave of pain suddenly coursed through Konohamaru's body, causing him to nearly visibly flinch. The jutsu was painful, which was something he learned the hard way when learning it. He had to continually regulate the heat flowing throughout his body. If at any moment Konohamaru lost control, he would be burned alive from the inside. Still a novice, there were brief moments when he would lose control, and the pain was unbelievable. Mizuki raised his hands to placate, "You're right, Konohamaru. You're right. There aren't any shortcuts. I see that now. I wanted to use the scroll to become powerful, but you've shown me the error of my ways. From now on, I'll work hard like you." His response was obviously made in an attempt to get out of his current predicament. However, even still, Konohamaru shifted his attention to the ground in apparent doubt. Seeing this as his opportunity, Mizuki began to approach the younger boy. The closer he got, the more and more discomfort he felt due to the unnatural heat that emanated from Konohamaru's form. Still, Mizuki endured it through gritted teeth. He needed Konohamaru to trust him again. However, before he could get close enough, Konohamaru's head shot back up, with a look of determination gracing his features. "Naruto taught me something that you never could, Mizuki-sensei. If not for him, I would have never discovered what it really means to be a shinobi," Konohamaru declared, much to Mizuki's chagrin. "Even if he really is the nine-tailed fox, he's still a better person than you'll ever be." Mizuki seemed to be momentarily stunned by Konohamaru's words. For the longest time, he had Konohamaru wrapped around his finger. Everything was going well, and then that bastard Nine Tails came into the picture and screwed everything up. He supposed the generational disconnect was to blame. Someone Konohamaru's age couldn't possibly fathom the destruction caused by the Nine Tails. "You're making a mistake, Konohamaru. Can't you see?" Mizuki warned. "You're throwing your lot in with the devil." Konohamaru shook his head and grinned. "You're the one who's wrong, Mizuki-sensei. You." Before Konohamaru could finish, he was forced to involuntarily grip his chest in pain. He collapsed onto his knees and began to hyperventilate. With each breath, he appeared to radiate more and more heat, and Mizuki was forced to take several steps back to avoid being burned by mere proximity. After creating a safe distance, Mizuki couldn't help but smirk at the sight. The kid had been so cocky not even a minute ago. "I guess it doesn't really matter who's right. Konohamaru?" Mizuki mocked, though it was likely that his words fell on deaf ears. Konohamaru's back then arched in an agonizing display. He let out a silent scream, and his body began to glow so intently that Mizuki could see the veins underneath his skin. The flame in his eyes grew more intense, flickering and poised to burn his flesh. Finally, when Mizuki began to see a deep fiery color emitting from Konohamaru's mouth, he realized what was about to happen and prepared to jump away. However, before Konohamaru, and likely Mizuki as well, were incinerated in the explosion, a glowing red chain emerged from the treeline. The chain coiled around Konohamaru's body, and almost immediately, the heat and the sensation of impending dread vanished. Konohamaru's body reverted to normal, though his skin was now singed and deeply red, as if he had a bad sunburn. Once the crisis appeared to have been averted, the chain returned to where it had come from. Konohamaru collapsed onto the ground, now unconscious. Shortly after, out of the shadows and the flickering flame of the forest, Naruto appeared. Mizuki watched him advance with caution. The forest was still burning, and unless he was willing to run through fire, it would be difficult to escape while being pursued. To make matters worse, the rising smoke would no doubt attract the attention of those searching for the missing scroll, so he'd need to act quickly. He'd have to kill the Nine Tails brat here and now. Naruto showed little interest in Mizuki and instead chose to ignore the Chunin in favor of checking Konohamaru's pulse. Seizing the opportunity, Mizuki removed the last of his remaining Fukma shuriken from his back and aimed for Naruto's blind spot. Once that was successful, he'd kill Konohamaru, cut his losses, and escape. Sure, he'd failed in his endeavor, but now he'd live to fight another day. Mizuki threw his weapon, watched it along its path, and grinned in anticipation as it inched closer and closer to its target. However, the blood drained from his face when Naruto inexplicably reached out and plucked the spinning projectile out of the air. Mizuki observed Naruto's outstretched arm and was appalled when he saw that the boy's nails had elongated and sharpened, almost resembling claws. Naruto then looked over his shoulder, and any remaining will to fight abandoned Mizuki. He found himself face to face with a pair of crimson eyes that burned with unspeakable fury. They were slitted, not unlike the eyes of a feline, and they were a sight that would be recognizable to anyone alive during the Nine Tails attack. The Nine Tails. The words came out of Mizuki's mouth as a hushed whisper that more than adequately reflected his terror. Naruto then stood to his feet, finally granting Mizuki his full attention. The boy's whisker-like marks were now thickened and more pronounced, as if they'd been roughly carved into his cheeks with a knife. His expression was that of contempt and thinly veiled fury. It made the situation even more terrifying, as his rage appeared to be controlled and calculated. "You think that I'm a monster," Naruto remarked, and Mizuki shuddered as the eerie sound of his voice violated his ears. "Would it bring you some comfort to be proven right in the end?" Mizuki opened his mouth, perhaps to beg for mercy, but no words managed to escape his lips. Then, in the blink of an eye, Naruto vanished in a burst of speed, and everything went black. Hours later, Naruto observed Konohamaru's unconscious form and frowned. After dispatching Mizuki, he immediately grabbed Konohamaru in his arms and rushed him to the hospital. The staff promptly snatched the boy out of his hands and brought him to the intensive care unit. It took a while before Naruto was given more information. Still, after what felt like hours, he was finally allowed to see him. The brat was still alive, but there was no telling whether or not his injuries would have any lasting effects. From what Naruto had been told so far, Konohamaru had apparently found some way to use nature transformation to convert his chakra into fire. So, essentially, he turned his body into an oven and nearly exploded from the inside. The little bastard was lucky to be alive. It would seem that my reckless curiosity is hereditary. A new voice surprised Naruto, who nearly jumped out of his seat as he turned to see who it was. He saw the Hokage himself, looking over his grandson with an almost weary smile. Naruto stood out of the way to give the Hokage some space to be with his grandson, but was stopped when the elderly man gestured for him to sit back down. After returning to his seat, Naruto's brows furrowed as he pondered what the Hokage had said. "What do you mean by hereditary?" The Hokage chuckled as if recalling an amusing memory. "I found myself in a similar position back when I was an inquisitive youth," he confessed. "I had always thought that if someone were to steal this particular forbidden jutsu, it would be one of my enemies, but to think it would be my own grandson. It makes me regret creating it in the first place." You created that jutsu? Naruto asked, his eyes widening in surprise. The Hokage did his best to look offended. Don't look so shocked, my boy. I am the Hokage. I've developed many jutsu over my lifetime, forbidden or otherwise. That was fair. One didn't earn the moniker of the professor unless they possessed both the ability to master ninjutsu and create their own. But still, Naruto had always viewed the Hokage as a sagely figure, so imagining him using such a destructive jutsu felt almost uncharacteristic. It would be like finding out that Seori collected postage stamps or knitted sweaters. Okay, now that he thought about it, that was definitely a bit of an exaggeration, but still. Then you'd know more than anyone how dangerous it is, Naruto remarked before shifting his attention back to Konohamaru. Is the kid gonna be okay? Were his eyes still on the Hokage, he'd have seen the man smiling at him fondly, worried about your new disciple. He asked in a knowing voice. Naruto frowned at the idea. Disciple? His? The responsibility still didn't seem all that appealing. Yet, he couldn't help but admire Konohamaru's determination. The kid had nearly burned himself alive, trying to prove he was worthy. In a way, he felt honored. If he were weak or untalented, a kid like Konohamaru wouldn't have been interested in learning from him. I understand the burden of mentorship very well, perhaps more so than anyone, the Hokage continued. I've produced success stories, utter failures, and everything in between. It weighs heavy on your shoulders, let me tell you. How am I qualified to teach anyone? Naruto responded with a shoulder shrug. I've only just graduated from the academy. It was you who taught him how to mold his chakra, was it not? The Hokage inquired. You succeeded where the academy failed. You somehow managed to grab my grandson's attention and keep it. That takes skill, my boy. Naruto smiled sardonically, all I did was teach him the same way I was taught. And what's so wrong with that? The Hokage asked with a shrug. All knowledge has to originate from somewhere. I was undoubtedly influenced by my teachers while teaching my own students. The goal of a teacher is to find a way to impart their knowledge to the next generation. How you do so isn't what's most important. Naruto mulled over the Hokage's words and shifted his attention back to Konohamaru. He couldn't help but feel responsible. Had he accepted the kid's request and agreed to become his teacher, Mizuki probably wouldn't have been able to trick him into stealing the scroll. A young boy had reached out to him seeking guidance, and he rejected him because he couldn't be bothered. I'm told that Konohamaru won't wake up for at least a couple of days, the Hokage remarked while placing a comforting hand on Naruto's shoulder. Use that time to think about what you'll say to him when he finally does. The Hokage chose that as his moment to leave. In the grand scheme of things, his visit hadn't been all that long, but he was a busy man, and at this point, Konohamaru's life was no longer at risk. Still, short as it was, Naruto was grateful for him stopping by. The Hokage had a way of saying a lot while only saying a little. Today, Naruto was lucky enough to be at the receiving end of some of his legendary wisdom. For the first time, he truly understood why that man was the Hokage. Hokage? The position had always fascinated him, even during his early years. The greatest heroes in the history of the village all held a position at some point. In fact, the third Hokage was the only one to retire outside of battle, while all the others died protecting the village somehow. And yet, once the fourth Hokage died, the third was required to take the hat once more. It was as if the universe was telling him that he wasn't destined for a normal death. He was the Hokage, after all. Looking back toward Konohamaru, he felt himself overtaken by a sense of certainty. Until this point, it had been nothing but doubts, but after hearing what the Hokage had to say, he was beginning to warm up to the idea of taking on a student. Sure, Konohamaru had already proven to be a pain in the ass. Still, in Naruto's experience, interesting people were seldom able to stay out of trouble. Alright, you stubborn little brat, Naruto remarked as if Konohamaru could hear him. I'll train you. However, a true teacher wouldn't let today's events be so easily forgotten. Yes. He'd have to find a suitable punishment. He was almost tempted to ask Kakashi, since the masked Jonin seemed to have a knack for humiliating bratty children. The thought made Naruto smirk deviously. Eavesdropping from outside the hospital room, the Hokage smiled warmly before finally leaving. Maybe today hadn't entirely gone as he'd planned, an understatement, but things still ended up fine in the end. A dangerous mission. Journey to the land of waves. When Seori arrived at the bridge, she was unsurprised to see Naruto already waiting there. She nearly scowled. She and Naruto had an unspoken competition for who would arrive at team meetings first. For the most part, they were both pretty consistent. One day she'd be first, and the next, he'd be first. But today was the first time that one of them had been first twice in a row. He was doing it to piss her off, and no, she definitely wasn't overthinking it. Seori observed the meeting place and nearly rolled her eyes at Kakashi's predictable absence. She was beginning to wonder how Kakashi held the rank of Jonin in the first place. He was undoubtedly skilled enough as a fighter. Still, it seemed as though he was pretty unreliable when it came to just about everything else. Someone who couldn't show up on time couldn't be counted on to complete ARS-ranked missions. "Good morning," Naruto greeted once he noticed her. Seori raised a brow at the admittedly unusual display. Ever since their fight 1 week prior, the two hadn't quite been on speaking terms, not that they ever really were in the first place. There wasn't any notable animosity, but there was certainly an ample amount of awkwardness. During their training exercise against Team 8, they were able to cooperate for the moments they were together. Still, they were quickly separated the moment the action began. There was no telling how well they'd work together on an actual mission. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to forget, she couldn't purge the image of his glare out of her mind. For a brief moment, it looked as though he would like nothing more than to strangle her to death with his bare hands. It was so unlike him. Naruto was always the one being annoying or pissing someone off. So seeing him get mad about something was like watching a fish walk out of a river and do the waltz. Seeing no reason to ignore him, Seori replied, albeit tersely, "Morning." With greetings out of the way, Seori found a place against the bridge's railings and leaned back. Kakashi was probably going to take a while to arrive anyway, so she decided to at least get comfortable. It got her thinking. Why the hell did she, Naruto, and Sakura even arrive on time in the first place? If they knew Kakashi would be an hour late, they should probably arrive late themselves. Though, knowing Kakashi, he'd probably choose to arrive on time the moment they tried. Sitting on top of the bridge's railing, Naruto began humming in a way that made Seori want to rip her hair out. God, he was so damn annoying. Of course, it was no accident. Even since they'd met, it seemed like he was acquiring data on her, figuring out what made her tick so that he could render her constantly upset or frustrated. It was cerebral, making her feel like some little kid whose buttons could be pressed easily. "You're not going to believe this," Naruto suddenly began, causing Seori to preemptively sigh in preparation for whatever ridiculous thing he was about to say. "But I became a teacher recently, you know." "A teacher? What the hell was he talking about?" Naruto continued with a smile. "So that would make me Naruto-sensei now. Pretty cool, right?" Seori gave Naruto a suspicious side-eyed glance. "You're right, I don't believe it. Who the hell would actually want to be your student anyway?" Naruto lurched back over the railing as if he had just been struck in the face. "I'll have you know that I have a lot of skill and knowledge to pass on. There isn't a student in the academy who wouldn't accept training from the great Naruto-sensei." Clearly unimpressed, Seori could only bring herself to roll her eyes at his stupidity. Replying to Naruto at this point would be tantamount to encouraging his foolish ramblings. For too long, she had been lowering herself to his level, allowing him to get under her skin and influence her mood. Well, no longer. From this point onward, she'd be an adult and simply ignore the mindless drivel that came out of his mouth. "Try rolling your eyes again. Maybe you'll actually find a brain back there this time." Seori felt her jaw clench at the insult. When Sakura finally got to the bridge, she was amused to see Naruto and Seori bickering. The atmosphere was charged with such an incredible tension that their glares appeared to generate electricity that arched back and forth between their eyes, causing sparks to fly. Sakura rubbed her tired eyes, and when she looked back, the sparks were gone, but Naruto and Seori were still very much at each other's throats. Having long since learned that there was no point trying to get in between them whenever they got like this, Sakura simply chose her spot on the bridge and leaned back in preparation for when Kakashi would finally arrive. As she watched Naruto and Seori argue, she couldn't stop a smile from spreading across her face. Perhaps it had all been in her head, but recently she had felt a strange tension between them. She was perceptive enough to notice that Kakashi-sensei had also detected the friction. Still, as usual, he kept out of their personal affairs. Sakura wasn't sure if their sensei's hands-off approach made him a good teacher or a bad one. On the one hand, it was the squad leader's responsibility to ensure that their team was a cohesive unit. Still, on the other, if Kakashi-sensei was always solving all of their problems, they wouldn't be able to function during missions without him. "They're so cute, aren't they?" Sakura felt her spine jolt, and her body became stiff as a board at the unexpected voice behind her. She slowly turned to see Kakashi crouched on the bridge railing with a level balance and concentration that appeared odd from such a lazy person. He gave her a casual wave as if he hadn't just scared her half to death, and she returned the gesture with a timid nod before turning back to her teammates. Due to their quarrel, Naruto and Seori hadn't detected the arrival of their sensei. Though the more likely explanation was that Kakashi-sensei was the type of person you didn't notice unless he wanted you to. She wondered if all jonin were terrifying in that way. The idea that she was standing so close to someone so far above her in terms of skill was rather daunting. "Are we finally going on a mission today, sensei?" Sakura asked as they continued to observe the bickering duo. Kakashi nodded, "Yep. I just met with Lord Hokage. Our client is waiting for us at the front gate as we speak." "Then shouldn't we head over there now?" Sakura asked, sounding somewhat perplexed. Maybe in a minute," Kakashi muttered. "Don't you enjoy watching those two bond together?" Sakura sighed. Sometimes it felt like she was the only sane person on her team. After packing their bags for their journey, Team 7 ventured to the front gates, where they would finally meet their client. Apparently, he was a master bridge builder from a country called the Land of Waves who needed to be escorted back home safely. It was a standard C-rank mission. At most, they'd have to contend with a couple of bandits, and even then, the sight of a shinobi escort was usually enough to ward off such thugs. Secretly, Seori was hoping some bandits would be stupid enough to test them. She was itching for a real life or death scenario that would test her mettle as a shinobi. Her spar with Naruto had been enough to get her blood pumping, but at no point did she feel her life was at stake. Seori, more than anything, wanted to put her life on the line. She wanted to know how she would react. "Alright, we'll be there in a few minutes," Kakashi announced as if his squad had never been to the front gate. He then shifted his attention to Naruto and Seori in particular. "Be good, you two." Naruto tried his best to look offended. "And what about Sakura?" he asked. To her credit, Sakura had the decency to blush at all the attention suddenly coming her way. "Sakura is the only one among you with any semblance of manners," Kakashi explained rather bluntly. "You seem to enjoy pushing people's buttons, and Seori doesn't seem to enjoy people at all." Accurate as that accusation may have been, Seori couldn't help but scowl. Was she seriously being lumped in with Naruto, of all people? A couple minutes passed before she then felt the blonde in question nudging her on the arm in an attempt to get her attention. Despite her better judgment, she obliged. "Worried?" he asked with a grin. Seori frowned. "What's there to be worried about?" she replied rather dismissively. Naruto shrugged before placing his hands behind his head. "You aren't all that tough to read," he explained. "You're worried that this mission will be a waste of time." Confirming or denying Naruto's suspicions was precisely what he wanted, so Seori decided that ignoring him was the best bet. He was kind of right, though. One of her biggest concerns about becoming a genin was the possibility that she'd have to waste her time on pointless missions. Escorting some guy back to his shitty little town wasn't something that got her blood pumping. When they finally arrived at the front gate, Seori couldn't help but curl her lip in disgust when she got her first look at the client. He was a fairly old gray-haired bespectacled man in his late 50s to early 60s with a bushy beard and dark eyes. It wasn't his appearance that Seori found to be repulsive, though. Instead, it was the fact that he seemed to think that now was the appropriate time to down an entire bottle of booze. It didn't help that most of it was dribbling into his beard. "Are you Mr. Tazuna?" Kakashi inquired once they were within speaking distance of the client. The client seemed perplexed as if he didn't even remember that he had hired a team of shinobi in the first place. Things eventually appeared to click in his head and he tossed his now empty liquor bottle to the side before stumbling forward to get a better look at his escorts. He adjusted his glasses before giving every member of Team 7 a brief glance over. "I paid for shinobi, not a bunch of brats," Tazuna complained. "Is this the best the Hidden Leaf has to offer?" Seori was suddenly tempted to show the old bastard what she had to offer him. On the other hand, Kakashi didn't seem at all affected by the blatant disrespect. "My team is more than qualified to handle a simple escort mission, Mr. Tazuna," he assured. "But if that doesn't put you at ease, I'll have you know that I'm a jonin with plenty of experience. You're in capable hands." Tazuna didn't appear convinced. "I'm a famous bridge builder, you know. A lot of people would cry if something happened to me." Seori tuned out the rest as they skipped through the remainder of the greetings before finally passing through the front gates. It was the first time Naruto and Sakura had ever left the village, so it was quite a big moment. Yet, their responsibilities didn't give them much opportunity to soak it all in. Although, Naruto did hang back for a moment to fully grasp the milestone before catching back up with the rest of the group. It was interesting seeing Naruto being sentimental. There was definitely more to him than initially met the eye. Seori supposed that was normal. Nobody was the same all the time, and Naruto and Kakashi seemed to have that in common. They had a talent for presenting themselves as one thing while being something completely different altogether. It made her wonder which Naruto was the real Naruto. As their journey commenced, the scenery was fairly consistent. Despite having left the village at their back some time ago, there were still forests as far as the eye could see. They stuck to the same dirt road and rarely stopped for any breaks. Tazuna had been strangely quiet since their departure, and it was beginning to make Seori nervous. Whenever people started acting out of character, that was usually the time to get worried. It was only after reaching that conclusion that she noticed that Naruto was staring intently at something on the road as they passed. She followed his gaze and was confused when she discovered that it was a simple puddle that seemed to captivate his attention. It took a moment for the implication of a puddle being on the road during spring to settle in her mind before she recognized the danger. Having taken notice of the puddle first, Naruto attempted to voice his concerns. "Sensei." However, two shadowy figures burst out of the puddle before he could finish what he was saying. They wore clawed gauntlets on their left and right hands, respectively, which were linked together by a lengthy serrated chain. Seori watched the duo as they leaped toward Kakashi with startling quickness. Unfortunately, he was too slow to react, and before anyone could make a move, Kakashi was ensnared by the chains. Once their target was caught, the two assailants spoke, one down. Team 7 watched as their sensei was shredded to pieces with a sickening noise. Sakura's anguished cries served as a signal for Seori to rush into action. Their squad leader was dead, but that didn't mean the mission was over. They still needed to protect the bridge builder. Speaking of which, after killing Kakashi, the murderous duo was now shifting their attention to Tazuna. Before any harm could befall the client, Seori threw a kunai that pinned the chain to a nearby tree. In a flash of speed, Seori jumped into the air and landed on both gauntlets. Before the would-be assassins could react, she grabbed the gauntlets in her hands and kicked them each in the face. The force of her attack was enough to knock the duo back and even detach the chain from their gauntlets. It was a bittersweet development, as while their opponents were deprived of one of their weapons, they were also free to move independently of the other. Despite the small victory, there was no respite in action. Now that they were separated, the assassins split up to attack different targets. One stayed put and began to engage Seori in hand-to-hand combat. At the same time, the other charged toward Tazuna with murderous intent. When Sakura realized she was the only thing standing between the enemy and the client, she felt a surge of fear. She supposed it was justifiable, given the circumstances, but she cursed her timidity all the same. Once her body came to terms with the fact that it was now or never, she steeled her nerves. She drew a kunai from her weapon pouch before lowering into a defensive position. "Stay behind me, sir," she warned, sounding as rattled as Tazuna looked. Then, just as the enemy was within arm's reach, an orange blur sailed into Sakura's line of vision. Naruto kneed the assassin in the face, launching him into the woods and effectively saving Sakura and Tazuna both. Before Sakura could even think to voice her appreciation, Naruto lunged in the very same direction he had sent the enemy flying. It wasn't long before Naruto vanished into the trees as well. Meanwhile, Seori was still fighting with the other assassin and having the time of her life no less. At that moment, she couldn't even remember that Kakashi had just been killed before her eyes. Her instincts had taken over as she delved into the deepest pit of her baser impulses. This was the kind of battle she had been searching for. These were the stakes that she wanted. Her fun was suddenly interrupted when Kakashi appeared out of nowhere, instantly snatching the enemy into his arm. The grip must have been incredibly tight, as the enemy quickly gasped for breath before losing consciousness. Seori wasn't sure whether she should be relieved that Kakashi was alive or disappointed that the fighting was over. So, in the end, she settled for an odd mixture of both. "Kakashi-sensei." Sakura shouted before pointing into the adjacent woods. "Naruto's in the woods fighting one of those shinobi." Seori watched as Kakashi's lone eye steeled over. "Seori, tie him up," he commanded rather simply before dropping the unconscious body of the enemy shinobi onto the ground like a sack of potatoes. Kakashi vanished in a puff of smoke, presumably en route to wherever Naruto was located. After he left, Seori reached into her weapon pouch and retrieved a spool of shinobi wire. It was a handy tool, perhaps one of her favorites. During training, she'd regularly use wires to direct her shuriken midair. It was like flying a kite, now that she thought about it. As she began tying up the enemy, she felt Sakura and Tazuna approaching from behind. "Are you alright, Seori?" Sakura inquired with apparent concern in her tone. "I'm fine." Tazuna, on the other hand, looked upon Seori with awe. "Good work, kid," he complimented while still trying to calm his nerves. "You definitely earned your pay just then." Sakura bobbed her head in agreement. "You reacted so fast," she said in adoration. "You and Naruto both." In truth, Seori hadn't even noticed Naruto in that action. She'd been so focused on handling her business that she didn't catch a glimpse of how he reacted. Based on what Sakura said, he apparently started fighting the other assassin, and the two ended up somewhere in the woods nearby. Still, seeing as Seori was the first to take action, she viewed it as her victory. Naruto got second place, which wasn't bad, but it wasn't first. Since she wasn't a complete jerk, Seori also offered Sakura some praise. "Good job staying with the client. You're better than I thought." She instantly regretted doing so when Sakura blushed in response. It was supposed to just be a simple compliment, and Sakura looked like she'd just been commended by the Hokage himself. Embarrassed at the attention, Seori averted her gaze and continued tying up the would-be assassin. Seori took the time to observe their new captive. He had wild shoulder-length brown hair and dark eyes. In terms of clothing, he wore a camouflage suit with bandages around his waist and dark-colored knee-length shinobi sandals. Most distinct, however, was the rebreather covering the lower half of his face and the sizable clawed gauntlet he wore on his left arm. "What village does this symbol represent?" Seori thought to herself as she observed his headband. She decided to turn to Sakura once more. "Sakura, what village uses this symbol on their headbands?" Sakura leaned over Seori's shoulder and squinted. I think that must be the Hidden Mist village, right?" "That's right, Sakura." The two girls were surprised to hear Kakashi's voice from behind them. When they turned to face him, Sakura flashed a bright smile when she saw that Naruto was standing at his side looking completely unharmed. Seori's attention, however, was more fixated on the body that Kakashi was carrying on his shoulder. It was the other assassin no doubt, and based on the deep bloody gash along his neck and his pale complexion, Seori deduced that he was dead. Had Kakashi killed him? These two were Chunin from the hidden mist, Kakashi explained, correcting himself halfway as he seemed to recall the corpse draped over his shoulder. The hidden mist village, eh? It didn't take a genius to figure out that the hidden mist village was associated with the land of water. So what brought them all the way to the land of fire? And, perhaps even more importantly, why were they targeting a random bridge builder? Seori eyed their client with thinly veiled suspicion. Clearly, there was more to this man than met the eye. Kakashi appeared to be following the same line of thought. I pretended to be killed so that I could learn who those shinobi were targeting, he revealed before leveling a stern gaze Tazuna's way. It seemed like they were after you, Mr. Tazuna. Tazuna looked down at the ground in apparent shame. We haven't heard anything about you being targeted by shinobi, Kakashi said. This mission was supposed to be protection from bandits, thieves, and the like. But to be faced with Chunin-level shinobi. That's beyond the scope of our mission agreement. So you had better have a good excuse for lying in your mission request, Mr. Tazuna. Sakura nodded in agreement. We aren't ready for this kind of mission, sir, she said, taking on a sympathetic tone. We should turn back. While she agreed that the client should be held responsible for lying, Seori wasn't at all on with Sakura's desire to abandon the mission. Just now, she had been gifted with a fantastic opportunity. With the possibility of engaging in such a battle once more, she wasn't about to head back home. I think we should keep going, sensei, Naruto chimed in, earning a look of shock from Tazuna. I mean, it's not like anyone was hurt or anything. Did the bridge builder muttered. Kakashi sighed. Naruto, there's a reason missions have specific ranks, he explained. It's so shinobi are given missions that align with their qualifications. You three have only been genin for a week. You shouldn't be led anywhere near a B-rank mission like this. Seori frowned. Kakashi was making it sound like they hadn't handled the ambush incredibly well. As Naruto said, nobody was injured and the assailants couldn't even touch the client. If those two hidden mist shinobi were Chunin, Seori was confident she could handle opponents at that level. And, if his impressive display was anything to go by, Kakashi would also make quick work of them. I agree with Naruto, Seori said, earning a look of surprise from Tazuna and one of dismay from Sakura. We can handle anything that's thrown our way. Seori glanced back in Naruto's direction and saw him give her a thumbs up. She rolled her eyes, unsure if he was messing with her or if he was genuinely grateful for her taking his side. Either way, it wasn't like she seconded his opinion because she wanted to have his back. No, she had her own reasons for wanting to continue with the mission, and none included Naruto. Geez, looks they're pretty set on this, Sakura, he remarked to his only sensible student. Very well, we'll continue for now, at least. Tazuna was pleased by the development, seeing as he ensured that he'd live for at least another day. He informed his escorts that they'd be nearing the coast soon and that he'd arranged transportation to the land of waves. With that, they continued on their journey. During their ferry ride to the island, they traveled silently through the fog. It was then that Tazuna finally revealed his nation's plight. A wealthy businessman named Gatm had taken over the land of waves and essentially made it his own. Anyone who resisted was put down. As a result, the land of waves was in a state of abject poverty, with only Tazuna's bridge serving as a hope for a better future. After hearing his story, not even Kakashi objected to continuing their mission. Upon their arrival in the land of waves, Team 7 was initially dropped off at a pier in a standard-looking fishing village. It was situated adjacent to the water and was interconnected by various docks and walkways. It was rather large, actually, and was incredibly beautiful. Yet, they didn't stay for long, as apparently Tazuna's home was further inland. It wasn't long before they were navigating through woodland paths once more. The terrain was very similar to the land of fire, which was to be expected since the two nations were so close. However, a distinct difference was that the land of waves felt wetter for lack of a better word. The air seemed saturated with water and the ground was almost moist underfoot. Seori felt the environment was actually soothing on her skin and closed her eyes for a brief moment of relaxation. Suddenly, the sound of something splitting through the air alerted the members of Team 7. Kakashi quickly shouted a warning before tackling Tazuna to the ground. Just in the nick of time, a massive cleaver-like sword spun directly where the aging bridge builder had been standing. Seori's eyes tracked the blade as it continued on its course before it eventually embedded itself in a tree. I didn't even hear it coming until the last possible moment, she internally chastised, realizing that her momentary lack of focus could have gotten herself killed. A man suddenly appeared in a flicker of movement, standing on the blade's hilt. He struck an imposing figure with short, spiky black hair, grayish skin, and dark brown eyes. He wore bandages that covered the bottom of his face, similar to Kakashi. He was shirtless with a pair of striped pants with white leopard printed leg and hand warmers. Seori's eyes quickly gravitated to his headband, which he sported sideways, and recognized the symbol of the hidden mist. She then looked to Hu-sensei, who hardly seemed intimidated. Well. If it isn't Zabuza Mamachi, he remarked, revealing the name of their enemy. If I am not mistaken, you're a rogue shinobi from the Hidden Mist village. Zabuza appeared to smirk underneath his mask. To think that my name carries weight even in the land of fire, he replied. And it's especially flattering coming from someone of your stature. The renowned copy ninja, Kakashi Haddock. Kakashi then gave his students a signal, and the trio of genin quickly sprung into action, forming a manji formation around Tazuna, allowing them to guard their client in all directions. However, Zabuza hardly appeared impressed as there was no noticeable shift in his demeanor. In fact, his gaze remained fixed on Kakashi. It was apparent that he only viewed Kakashi as the actual threat. Hard to imagine the likes of you protecting some lowly bridge builder, but now it all makes sense, Zabuza commented. The demon brothers didn't stand a chance against you. Not that they were anything special to begin with. And even harder to imagine a notorious A-rank shinobi like yourself working as Gaten's henchman, Kakashi countered, his hands remaining stuffed in his pockets. It makes me wonder. How much does selling out and sacrificing your pride earn someone these days? Instead of getting angry at the verbal quip, Zabuza merely chuckled. Don't act so high and mighty, Kakashi, he said. I couldn't care less who my client is, so long as I get paid. Seori's mind was racing. He was a shinobi hailing from the land of water, which meant that he was likely proficient with water-style ninjutsu. Her eyes then shifted to the lake that ran adjacent to the clearing where they were currently standing. It seemed that he had chosen a battlefield that would give him a decisive advantage. Of course, it went without saying that most of her fire-style ninjutsu would likely prove useless against such an opponent. But, on a positive note, that would mean that Naruto would likely have an edge as well. Her teammate was watching their enemy just as intently as she was, and she could only assume that he, too, was assessing the situation. From what she had gathered during their week as teammates, Naruto was very adept at water-style ninjutsu, so at least it was something in their favor. You know, back home, they talk about the Sharingan with almost mythical reverence, Zabuza announced, causing Seori to tense as she assumed that he had somehow figured out who she was. It'll be a pleasure to finally see it in action, Kakashi. Seori's eyes widened in surprise, and she turned to face her sensei, who remained unfazed. In the interest of saving time, I think I'll humor you, Kakashi casually replied before raising his headband, revealing that his left eye had a vertical scar running down it. But it was when he finally opened the eye that Seori froze. There was no mistaking it. Kakashi's left eye was a Sharingan. It was fully evolved too with 3 Tomo, which was more than even she possessed at the moment. Upon seeing the eye, her mind was bombarded by so many thoughts that she couldn't even begin to choose which to address first. In the end, she settled for wondering who the hell her sensei actually was and why he possessed the eye of her clan. There it is. The eye that's allowed you to copy over 1,000 jutsu, Zabuza revealed, much to Team 7's shock, as they were unsure if the statement was merely hyperbole. I wonder if, among all those jutsu, you possess one powerful enough to actually kill me. Kakashi removed his remaining hand from his pocket before using it to massage his neck. The odds aren't in your favor, you know. Zabuza's eyes widened as Kakashi began to rapidly weave through a set of hand signs in the blink of an eye. Finally, he managed to wrench his blade out of the tree and jump out of the way just in time as a massive fireball came careening toward him. Having narrowly avoided the impact, Zabuza landed on the lake surface, much to Tazuna's shock. He's standing on water. He muttered in awe as if he hadn't just witnessed someone launch a ball of flames from their mouth. Seori, on the other hand, was more focused on her sensei. He possessed her clan's Kekkei Genkai and demonstrated proficiency with one of their signature jutsu. He certainly didn't resemble an Uchiha, though. She would have probably recognized him if he was indeed a member of her clan, or he would have undoubtedly revealed his identity to her by now. Which could only leave one possibility. Is his Sharingan implanted? She pondered as she remembered the scar over his eye. Her curiosity was then replaced with suspicion. Did he steal it? She then noticed Naruto staring intently at Kakashi's back and remembered how he had reacted upon seeing her awaken Sharingan during their spar a week ago. Now certainly wasn't the time for another outburst on his part. Still, either way, she imagined that he was just as confused about the new development as she was. Her moment of rumination was interrupted when she heard Zabuza laugh, no, more like a cackle. Then, she began to notice the air become thick with an almost unnatural mist. Despite most of them being within arm's reach, she began to have trouble seeing her comrades or the client. Even activating her Sharingan didn't help. The mist was saturated with chakra, making it impossible for her to make out any of the signatures surrounding her. Make a single move, and you're dead, Kakashi warned, his tone taking on a more serious edge. Zabuza is a master of the silent killing jutsu. He's trained his entire life to fight under these conditions and can move completely silently through the mist. Team 7 found their eyes widening with shock, and Tazuna was too horrified to even fathom what was happening. Seori could feel him trembling behind her back and could smell the alcohol from his bated breath. Naruto was opposite her, so she couldn't quite gauge his reaction. Sakura wasn't faring all that better than Tazuna, as Seori could hear the kunai rattling in her comrade's hands. "Look at all these sacks of flesh, ripe for the picking," Zabuza spoke, though his voice echoed through the mist in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint his location. "Now, which of you will I put down first?" Seori felt her body seize in panic as the sound of Zabuza's voice slithered into her ears. This feeling. The intensity of his malice was making her sick. She felt that if she took a breath or even blinked her eyes, she would be instantly marked for death. So this was what it felt like to be faced with a jonin who intended to kill. She couldn't stand the feeling. If she had to endure it for much longer, she'd go mad. Her knuckles popped under the strain of how tightly she gripped her kunai, which was now visibly shaking due to the intensity of her grip. She contemplated escaping this hell on her own terms as she looked down at her weapon. Yet, the thought immediately vacated her mind when she heard her sensei speak. "Seori," Kakashi said calmly as if he could read her thoughts. "I know it's difficult, but ignore him. I won't let him get close to any of you." Kakashi then formed the ram hand seal and summoned his chakra until it became visible around him. The force of this act was enough to dissipate the mist slightly, at least to the degree where Team 7 could see one another. Now in view of his team, Kakashi looked over his shoulder to face them. When he did, Seori immediately felt her fear and anxiety vanish. "I won't allow any of my comrades to die," he assured, his eyes crinkling up in a smile. But the fear returned tenfold when she felt a voice directly behind her. Spoken like a man who's failed before. Zabuza was crouched in the middle of the manji formation, having moved so quietly and with such speed that nobody had even seen him until it was nearly too late. Thankfully, Kakashi sprung into action and blitzed the rogue shinobi with a kunai in hand. However, before Zabuza could attempt to cleave Tazuna in two, he found the kunai plunged into his stomach. Naruto grabbed Tazuna and leaped back, creating distance between their client and the ensuing battle. Inwardly admiring her teammates' quick thinking, Seori was forced to move in a completely different direction altogether. Once she landed, she observed the wound that Kakashi had managed to inflict on Zabuza and was surprised to see that it was leaking water and not blood. Zabuza then burst into a pool of water, revealing himself to have been a water clone all along. He was clever. Rather than trying to assassinate Tazuna from the beginning, he was trying to separate them all to make his target as vulnerable as possible. Despite herself, she couldn't help but admire his ruthless calculation. "Sensei!" Sakura suddenly shouted in warning. "Behind you." Kakashi didn't have enough time to react as Zabuza, likely the original, appeared behind him with his cleaver cocked back. With a single swing, he managed to cleave Kakashi in two. Seori was shocked for an instant before she saw her sensei disperse into water in the same way that Zabuza had earlier. This was the second time today he'd averted death. Meanwhile, Zabuza appeared shocked at seeing his opponent demonstrate such skill in the jutsu of his village. Kakashi then appeared behind him in a manner reminiscent of the tactic that Zabuza had just employed earlier. Yet, Kakashi was apparently more reasonable, merely placing a kunai against his opponent's neck. "Give up," he warned, his voice missing any laid-back undertones with which it was usually associated. "You're done." Despite his momentary surprise, Zabuza appeared more amused than anything else. "You speak with such confidence, Kakashi," Zabuza asked before laughing. "Did you actually think you could step into my world and beat me with cheap parlor tricks?" Seori felt her brow furrow in worry. Despite it seeming as though the battle was all but finished, Zabuza didn't seem concerned at all. It could possibly just be bravado, but her gut was telling her otherwise. Something was definitely wrong, and the battle was far from over. "But I must say, you're good. To think that you're so well versed with the water clone jutsu," Zabuza continued. "You made quite a racket earlier, so I'd target your clone. Impressive." Just as he finished, Zabuza dissipated into a puddle of water, revealing himself to also be a water clone. The real Zabuza then appeared at Kakashi's back with his blade cocked back, ready to cleave him in two. Thankfully, Kakashi crouched down just in the nick of time. Due to the force of his swing, Zabuza's blade was embedded in the ground and then he let go of the hilt before kicking Kakashi into the river. Zabuza then wrenched his blade out of the ground before vanishing in a burst of speed. Kakashi quickly rose out of the water but appeared incredibly weighed down and sluggish. As he tried to move, he noted that the water felt unnaturally dense and heavy. However, Zabuza appeared behind him on the water's surface before he could react. "Copy your way out of this," he taunted while weaving through hand seals. "Water style. Water prison jutsu." The water surrounding Kakashi rose out of the lake and encased him in a sphere. Zabuza was holding the sphere of water in place with his right hand while laughing at Kakashi's misfortune. "I'll admit, a part of me is disappointed with your performance. But, let's see what your little friends can do, Zabuza mocked before executing a single hand seal. Water clone jutsu. The humanoid shape then rose out of the water before shifting into a perfect clone of Zabuza. Despite being just a clone, Seori felt just as uneasy about the sheer power and malice that this clone emanated. With their current strength, they wouldn't even be able to scratch a mere clone of this guy, let alone take on the real deal. This was bad, really bad. Well, what do you say, kids? Zabuza jeered. Your sensei is beaten, and you don't have the strength to take me on. So how about you leave the bridge builder behind, and I'll let you live. When it was clear that Team 7 wouldn't respond, Zabuza vanished in a flash of speed. Naruto didn't even have time to blink before he was targeted, resulting in him being kicked square in the face. The force of the strike was enough to send him skidding across the clearing. The sight caused Sakura to cry out in worry and Seori to tense at the possibility of being next. The lingering terror she had been experiencing at the beginning of the battle had subsided slightly, but she was still hardly feeling confident. "Take Mr. Tazuna and run." Kakashi shouted from inside the water prison. "The fight ended the moment I was caught, but as long as he's keeping me trapped in this prison, he can't move. The water clone can't go very far from his real body. So run away, now." The water clone of Zabuza didn't appear all that concerned with what Kakashi was saying. In fact, his attention was still focused solely on Naruto. Having not completely recovered her bearings after the initial attack, Naruto couldn't react to Zabuza stomping down on Naruto's head with a thunderous crack. "I can't just stand here and watch," she thought before charging into action. Seori ignored the panicked shouting of both Sakura and Kakashi and threw several shuriken at Zabuza. It proved a relatively easy attack to defend against. Zabuza simply swatted them out of the air with the flat edge of his massive blade. Seori then ventured into the air and attempted a downward thrust with a kunai. Zabuza merely reached up as a counter and caught her by the neck. "Another person with a Sharingan, eh?" Zabuza remarked. The sheer force of Zabuza's grip around her throat was astonishingly tight, and Seori was confident that she would lose consciousness quickly if she didn't do something. Her eyes then gravitated to the ground, and she saw Naruto, with Zabuza's foot planted onto his back. They made eye contact, and an unspoken plan seemed to exchange between them. Seori dropped the kunai she had been holding in her hand, making sure to make it look like she had lost her grip due to the lack of air. Naruto caught the kunai before it could hit the ground and viciously slashed Zabuza's water clone across the tendon. Predictably, water trickled out instead of blood, and Zabuza's clone quickly dispersed into a puddle of water. Even though it had only been a clone, they couldn't help but view it as a victory. Seori landed deftly on the ground, and when she took a few breaths and regained her bearings, she saw Naruto standing at her side. He was smirking while also holding out the kunai she had given him during the exchange. "You dropped this," Naruto joked. "And at the perfect time too." Seori barely suppressed a smirk of her own and shook her head. "Focus, you moron." It was strange for Seori to feel so comfortable fighting at someone's side. Sure, she had worked with Naruto and Sakura during the bell test, but this was different. Earlier in the battle, she had felt terrified, but now, a distinct feeling of confidence lingered in her chest. Alone, they didn't stand a chance, but together, they might be able to free their sensei and survive. Naruto's eyes then took on an all too familiar devious glint. "Anyway, follow my lead. I'll need a distraction, though." Even though he had just witnessed his clone's destruction, Zabuza appeared more amused than anything else. The little brats had gotten lucky. And yet, for all their efforts, they weren't any closer to coming out on top in this little battle. So, to break their morale, Zabuza formed the hand seal for the water clone jutsu once more, and another copy rose out of the river. Back at the other side of the clearing, Naruto and Seori prepared themselves for an attack just in time as Zabuza's new water clone charged toward them. In response, Seori weaved through several hand seals before ending with the tiger seal. She then expelled chakra-infused ash from her mouth that blanketed almost the entire area. Zabuza's water clone was caught in the thick of the jutsu and had to cover his face to protect himself from the ash. The jutsu wasn't powerful enough to cause him to dispel, but it burned his skin and prevented him from opening his eyes. The only silver lining was that if he couldn't move through the ash, his opponents wouldn't either. Once the ash began to clear, Zabuza finally opened his eyes and was surprised to see dozens of clones of the blonde kid lunging towards him. When the first clone entered his guard, he quickly dispatched it with his sword. But, to his mild surprise, the clone burst into a cloud of smoke once it was dispelled. "Shadow clones," he thought to himself as he effortlessly took down even more of the copies. Impressive at that age. Regardless, even the most powerful jutsu would be ineffective in the hands of a novice. The remaining clones who hadn't already been defeated decided to attack all at once. Each brandishing a kunai, they tried to jump into the air and simultaneously turn Zabuza into a human pincushion. Unfortunately, Zabuza efficiently managed to dispel nearly all the clones with a single swing of his sword. Witnessing the one-sided beatdown, Tazuna could only look on in dismay. "This is it, isn't it?" he mumbled. "We're definitely dying here." Only the original Naruto remained, and as he was skidding back from the impact of Zabuza's attack, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a collapsible Fuma shuriken. He then threw it to Seori, who deftly caught it before releasing the weapon. Zabuza couldn't help but scoff at what he perceived as a pitiful display. "A shuriken? That's your plan?" he taunted. "A shuriken can't touch me." Unperturbed by his dismissal, Seori vanished in a flash of speed before reappearing in the air above. She spun her body to create momentum before hurling the shuriken at the perfect moment. Her Sharingan tracked the weapon's movement and she watched as it advanced towards Zabuza with impressive speed. Then, to the shock of the man in question, the weapon passed the clone entirely. The real Zabuza merely squinted as he watched the Fuma shuriken approach. It seemed those two brats realized the futility of attacking his clone and decided to aim for his actual body instead. Admittedly, it was an acceptable tactic. Still, the execution could have been better. Did they genuinely expect to finish his off with a mere shuriken? HMPH, nice try, Zabuza remarked before effortlessly catching the shuriken in his left hand. However, his moment of triumph was quickly interrupted as he saw a second, identical shuriken heading his way in the same path as the first. A shuriken hidden in the shadow of the first, Zabuza observed. He recognized this particular jutsu. It was the Shadow Shuriken Jutsu, a technique made famous by Hidden Leaf Shinobi during the previous 3 wars. Meanwhile, Sakura observed the shocking development and couldn't help but be flooded with hope. On the other hand, Naruto and Seori were far more compassed as they observed their plan in action. The second shuriken was on target and there was no way that Zabuza would be able to catch it. As he had no other means of avoiding the attack, Zabuza simply jumped over it. Sakura openly gasped at the display, as she had never considered the possibility that their enemy would be able to avoid the attack in such a dexterous manner. All their efforts seemed to be for naught yet, despite it all, a small smirk spread over Naruto and Seori's faces. Suddenly, the shuriken Zabuza had just avoided burst into smoke, revealing it to actually be Naruto using the transformation jutsu. Perhaps even more shockingly, he held a large shuriken that seemed to be made from glowing red chakra. Everyone was shocked by Naruto and Seori's clever strategy and the strange weapon Naruto was wielding. At close proximity, Naruto lurched back and threw the chakra shuriken directly at Zabuza's exposed back. At this distance, Zabuza wouldn't be able to dodge and he wasn't given much time to weigh his options. Ultimately, he did the only thing he could and pulled his hand out of the water prison. Still, the chakra shuriken barely managed to graze him on the cheek, drawing blood. The water prison surrounding Kakashi collapsed back into the water and Zabuza felt a deep rage building in the pit of his stomach. This little brat managed to draw blood from him just now and concocted a plan that turned the tide of the battle back in his team's favor. On instinct, Zabuza began spinning the Fuma shuriken that he held in his hand and set his aim for Naruto. Currently descending into the river, Naruto could only watch with wide eyes as he realized that he had just become a target. Zabuza pulled back his arm, telegraphing his throw, and Naruto tucked his arms into his body in a preemptive effort to protect his vital spots. "You cheeky bastard." Zabuza shouted, fully intent on destroying Naruto there and then. Seori felt her blood run cold at the possibility that Naruto would be killed. Sure, he was an annoying prick, but she'd be lying if she said that over the past few weeks, she hadn't started getting used to him. Their competitions for who would arrive first, his stupid attempts at getting on her nerves, and their mutual desire to improve and grow stronger were all things she had grown accustomed to. However, before Zabuza could land a fatal blow, Kakashi appeared in a flash and blocked the shuriken with his closed fist. The metal plate on the backhand of his glove allowed him to absorb the attack with minimal damage, but his hand was still rendered bloody. Naruto fell into the water with a splash, but in this case, getting wet was the least of his worries. He was smart enough to realize that had Kakashi not intervened, he would have definitely been killed just then. The very thought caused his stomach to churn. He would have been dead. There would be no coming back from that and he would have left this world having achieved none of his goals. The very thought was sickening. Soaked, with water dripping down his face, Kakashi raised his head and looked Zabuza in the eye. Upon linking his gaze with the copy ninja, Zabuza couldn't help but flinch at the fierce glare he was receiving. It was exacerbated by Kakashi's Sharingan, which for a single moment made him look like a man possessed. Even someone like Zabuza couldn't help but be taken aback at the sight. "Kakashi-sensei!" Sakura shouted with glee. Seeing their